Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I never really thought about automatic car washes until it happened to me. I had just finished a long shift at work and figured I'd get my car washed before heading home. It wasn't the first time I'd been to this place, so I figured it would be a quick and easy stop. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, especially not what happened that day. The place was one of those drive-through automatic car washes, the kind where you just pull in, put the car in neutral, and let the machines do their thing. There were a few cars ahead of me in line, so I had to wait for my turn. Nothing unusual so far, just sitting there with the engine off, trying to kill time on my phone. Eventually, it was my turn, and I slowly pulled forward into the wash bay. I rolled my windows up, locked the doors, and set my phone down. I'd done this dozens of times before. The car wash started with the usual sounds, the rumbling of the machines, the whoosh of the water spraying down. I wasn't thinking about anything specific, I just sat there, watching the brushes move around my car. Then, just as the machines were about to start scrubbing the sides of the car, I felt a weird sensation. It was like I wasn't alone in the car. At first, I thought it was just the water hitting the windows and the noise of the machines, but something felt off. It was almost like someone was standing right outside my window. I turned my head quickly to the side, trying to shake the feeling. That's when I saw him. A man. He was standing at the driver's side of my car, looking directly at me. I couldn't make out much of his features, just a vague outline of his face and body. His face was pressed up against the window, and he was staring straight at me. It wasn't the kind of look you get from someone casually passing by, it was different. It was intense. Almost predatory. I froze. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing. It didn't make any sense. The car wash was fully automated. No one was supposed to be outside the car, let alone that close to it. He didn't seem like an employee, and there was no reason for him to be standing there. I tried to ignore him, hoping he would just go away. I focused on the lights from the machines, the noise, anything to distract me. But then I saw it, his hand. He was trying to open the door. Slowly, carefully, as if he knew I was watching. His fingers wrapped around the door handle, and he pulled. I immediately locked the door again, but it was too late. My heart started pounding. I knew something was wrong. Who the hell was this guy? Why was he trying to get into my car? I looked around, but the other cars in the wash bay were too far away for anyone to notice what was going on. I was completely alone, stuck in the narrow passage with this man. I couldn't move. The car wash had already begun, and there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. I looked at the rearview mirror, hoping to see anyone working the machines, but the wash was automated, and I didn't see anybody. The man's hand was still on the door handle. He was pulling again, this time more forcefully. I wasn't sure if he was trying to break in or just see if he could get it open. Either way, I didn't feel safe. I felt like I was in danger. Panic started to set in. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe properly. I started looking for my phone, but I couldn't find it right away. The machines were making so much noise, and I was so focused on what the man was doing that I couldn't think clearly. I finally grabbed my phone, but it took me a few seconds to unlock it. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing. I dialed 911 as quickly as I could, but the call didn't go through right away. I could feel my heart pounding harder, louder in my chest. The man was still there, still tugging on the door, trying to get in. I could see his face now, his expression getting angrier, like he was frustrated that I wouldn't let him in. Finally, the call connected. The dispatcher asked what the emergency was, and I could barely get the words out. "Someone's trying to break into my car," I said, my voice trembling. I told them where I was, the address of the car wash. I could barely keep my thoughts straight. I didn't even know what to do anymore. The dispatcher told me to stay calm and keep the doors locked. She said someone would be there soon, but I didn't know if I could wait. The man hadn't stopped trying to get in. Every time I looked over, he was still there, trying the door handle, his eyes locked on mine. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the car wash machine started to wind down. The brushes stopped spinning, the water stopped spraying. I was almost done, and the car wash was over. The last thing I needed was for the door to open and the man to get inside. I wasn't sure if he would leave, or if he was planning to do something worse. But as soon as the wash was over and the machine stopped, I saw the man step back, just a few feet from my car. He didn't move toward the door again. He just stood there, staring at me. For a moment, we locked eyes, and I could see the anger in his expression. It wasn't just about getting into the car anymore. It was like he was angry that I hadn't let him in. Without thinking, I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the wash bay as quickly as I could. I looked behind me and saw the man standing there, still watching, but I didn't look back again after that. I drove straight to the nearest police station, my hands still shaking. The cops couldn't find the man when they checked the car wash, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I gave them a full description, but I didn't feel safe until I was home and locked inside my apartment. I haven't been to that car wash since. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. But I learned a valuable lesson: never be too complacent. Even in the most routine, ordinary situations, you never know who might be watching. I was at the park last Tuesday afternoon, just trying to enjoy a rare moment of peace. It had been one of those weeks where everything felt off. Work was stressing me out, family drama was brewing, and I just needed some fresh air. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over everything, and there weren't many people around, just a few joggers and a couple of families having picnics. I found a bench under a tree, opened my book, and tried to tune everything out. I should have known the moment I sat down that I wasn't going to get much peace. But at the time, I thought it was just me being overly anxious. I'd been there for about 20 minutes when I heard footsteps approaching. I didn't look up right away, assuming it was just someone walking by. But the footsteps stopped. "Hey," the man said, his voice almost too calm. It wasn't a loud greeting, just the kind of voice that made you feel like you didn't have a choice but to acknowledge it. I glanced up. He was standing about a foot away from the bench, looking at me with an almost unsettling intensity. Mid-30s, maybe a little older, with dark hair and a face that looked familiar but not in any specific way. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, but there was something about him that felt off. Like he didn't belong in this peaceful scene. "Do you come here often?" he asked. It's a typical question, right? One of those small talk openers. I nodded, deciding to be polite. "Yeah, it's nice here. Just needed some quiet today." "Quiet's good, yeah," he said, sitting down on the other end of the bench without asking. He wasn't close, but still, he was uncomfortably near. I figured I'd just finish my chapter and leave, but something in my gut told me to be cautious. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I could feel a shift in the air. He stayed quiet for a moment, then spoke again. "You like to read?" "Yeah, I do," I answered, trying to remain neutral, hoping he would take the hint that I was just here to enjoy the day alone. He leaned forward slightly, and that's when I started getting that prickling feeling along my skin. He wasn't just making small talk anymore. It felt like he was trying to dig deeper. "What's your favorite kind of book?" he asked, his voice low, almost too curious. "I like a lot of different kinds," I said, stiffening. "Just whatever catches my attention." He nodded, then smiled a little, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something unsettling about it, something that made my stomach twist. I tried to ignore the feeling, but it was getting harder. "Are you married?" he asked, his voice softer now, like it was an innocent follow-up. I raised an eyebrow, confused. "No," I said, unsure why he was asking such personal questions. But the tone of his voice was changing, almost like he was trying to dig into my life, piece by piece. "Do you live around here?" he continued. It wasn't a question anymore. It was more like he was gathering information, like he needed it for some unknown reason. At this point, I knew something was wrong. My hands were starting to sweat, and my heart rate had picked up. This wasn't normal. Most people don't ask these kinds of questions out of nowhere. And I didn't know if it was just the vibe he gave off or the way he was staring at me, but it made me feel small. Like I was trapped in this conversation without a way to escape. I tried to push myself off the bench, clutching my book like it could offer some kind of protection. "I'm sorry, I need to go." But before I could get to my feet, he stood up too, stepping in front of me. "You're leaving already?" His voice had dropped, becoming sharper. I was just trying to talk. I didn't answer, just took a step back. My body was telling me to move quickly, to get away from him, but my legs felt frozen. Wait," he said, his tone suddenly more forceful, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "You can't just sit here and waste my time and then walk away." I froze. What did he mean, waste his time? I didn't owe him anything. I barely even knew him. "I'm sorry," I said, now trying to move around him, trying to be polite but firm. "I don't know you. I'm just trying to enjoy my day." "You owe me a conversation," he said, stepping closer. "You don't get to walk away after wasting my time." I was now completely unnerved. I could feel my body reacting before I even had a chance to process it. My eyes darted around the park, looking for anyone, any kind of help, but the place was empty. The joggers had passed, and the families had packed up and left. It was just the two of us. I stood taller, trying to make myself seem less vulnerable. "I don't owe you anything," I said firmly, stepping back again. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking, but I wasn't going to let him see it. "Leave me alone." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might get angry. But instead, he just stood there, staring at me. The silence between us stretched, and I could feel the tension building, like he was trying to decide what to do next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he just shook his head and mumbled something under his breath. "Fine. But don't think you can just do that. People don't just get to ignore me." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction, my heart racing in my chest. I could hear his footsteps behind me for a few moments, but when I glanced over my shoulder, he was no longer following. It felt like a lifetime until I reached my car and locked the doors. I drove home with my hands still trembling on the steering wheel, my mind replaying the entire encounter over and over. What had just happened? Why did it feel so wrong? Why did it feel like he was trying to corner me into something I didn't understand? It was just a conversation, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like I was the target of something much darker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided a very dangerous situation. I haven't gone back to that park since. And every time I see someone approach me in public now, I can't help but feel that same unease, that same fear. I don't think he was just some random person looking for company. I don't know what his intentions were, but I'm not willing to find out. If anything, I learned to trust my instincts more, because I know now that sometimes people don't need to say much to make you feel trapped. I wasn't expecting to find anything out of the ordinary that morning. It was just a simple walk through the park. I like going early, before it gets crowded, when the air is still cool and everything feels calm. It's a good way to clear my head. I'm not the type to run or jog, but I enjoy a good, quiet walk with a coffee in hand. The park was pretty much empty that day, save for a couple of joggers in the distance and a few people walking their dogs. The sun had barely risen above the trees, casting a soft light over the benches and paths. It was peaceful, just the way I liked it. I was heading down my usual route near the lake when I saw a backpack sitting on a bench all alone. I've always been the type to look out for lost items, especially in public places. Maybe it's because I know how stressful it can be to lose something important, like a wallet or a phone, and I'd hate for someone to go through that. I walked over to the bench, thinking I'd find something innocuous. Maybe some school books or a jacket someone had forgotten. But when I picked it up, I noticed how heavy it felt. Not just heavy, though it felt odd. There was something about it that made me pause. The straps were perfectly aligned, and it was sitting so neatly on the bench that it didn't look like it had been casually discarded. It almost seemed like someone had placed it there intentionally. I figured I'd check inside, just to make sure it was truly abandoned, and there wasn't anything personal in it. Maybe there was a wallet or ID so I could contact the owner. The zipper was a little stiff, but it opened easily enough. Inside, I found a few things that seemed normal: a water bottle, a couple of notebooks, some snacks, nothing unusual. But then I saw something that made my stomach twist. There was a small, unmarked envelope at the bottom. It wasn't sealed, just folded over once. I pulled it out cautiously, trying not to get too curious. I didn't want to pry, but I couldn't help but wonder what it was. As I unfolded it, I noticed the handwriting on the front neat, almost professional looking. It didn't say anything except for a name, Jonas. The name didn't mean anything to me, but still, something about it made me feel uncomfortable. I'm not sure why, but I quickly folded the envelope back up and placed it back into the bag. The rest of the items seemed entirely ordinary, so I decided to take the backpack to the lost and found, as I usually do when I find something like this. I stood up to leave the bench, holding the bag by the straps, when I heard a voice behind me. "Hey! That's mine. What are you doing with my bag?" I turned around, startled. A man, probably in his mid-30s, was standing a few feet away. He was tall, wearing a black hoodie and sweatpants. His expression was tense, and he was staring right at me, his eyes hard. I froze for a moment, confused. "Ah, sorry, I didn't mean to take it," I said, holding up the bag. "I found it here on the bench." I was going to take it to the lost and found. The man took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "No, that's my bag. You're stealing it. Give it back." I blinked, thrown off by his response. "What?" "No, I'm not stealing it." "Give it back," he interrupted, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of the few people walking by. "That's my property. You can't just take things that aren't yours." I tried to stay calm, still holding the bag out in front of me. "Look, I wasn't trying to steal it. I found it on the bench, and I was just going to turn it in. The man took another step forward, closing the distance between us. His face had become flushed, his eyes wild. "No, it's mine. You don't know what's in there, but it's mine. You have to return it." I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me was starting to feel a little intimidated, but at the same time, something didn't sit right with me about his behavior. Why was he acting so frantic? People don't usually get that worked up over a bag, especially if they've left it unattended. But I wasn't going to give him the bag without some explanation. "I'm not giving it to you without knowing why you're so upset," I said, my voice steady, but a little more firm now. "If it's really yours, you can take it to the lost and found and prove it." His face twisted into a scowl. "I'm not going to the lost and found. I want it now. Just give it to me." The way he was acting made me uneasy. It was as though he wasn't just upset about losing a bag, there was something deeper behind it. Something more desperate. I tried to step back, thinking maybe I could walk away without any more confrontation, but as soon as I moved, the man took a step toward me again. "Hey," he shouted. "Give it to me. You have no right to take it." His voice had started to raise to an almost shouting level, and I could see some of the people walking past us now turning to look. I didn't want a scene, and I didn't want to provoke him further, but I also didn't want to hand the bag over to someone who might not be the rightful owner. I glanced around, hoping someone might step in, but the few people nearby were just standing there, watching. "I'm just going to take it to the lost and found," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. The man's expression twisted with fury, and for a moment, I thought he might lunge at me. Instead, he stepped back, taking a deep breath like he was trying to control his anger. "You don't know what you're messing with," he said, almost to himself. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. What did that even mean? Was this just some crazy guy, or was there something more sinister going on? My heart was racing now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole situation. He stepped back again, eyes never leaving me, and then he said something that sent a shiver through me. "You don't understand. You have to return what's mine." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the park. I stood there for a long time, unsure of what had just happened. I thought about following him, reporting him, or maybe just finding a police officer. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had no solid proof he was even the rightful owner of the bag. I didn't know if it was his or not. And I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had handed it over to him, something worse might have happened. I decided not to take any chances. Instead of going straight to the lost and found, I left the park and went to a nearby cafe to sit for a while, trying to calm down. I left the backpack in the back seat of my car, unsure of what to do next. I never went back to that park. I never saw that man again, but every time I passed that bench, I can't shake the feeling that I missed something important. And part of me wonders what was in that bag. What did he want so badly that he was willing to make such a scene? I can't help but think it was something more than just a simple backpack. It started out like a regular stop. I was driving back from a long road trip, somewhere between exhausted and delirious from being in the car for hours. I pulled into a gas station just off the highway, hoping to stretch my legs and grab a drink. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. It was one of those typical, half-lit, low-key places where you'd stop just to fuel up and keep moving. The pumps were almost empty, with only a couple of other cars scattered around the lot. I parked near the front, ready to top off my tank and grab some snacks. The weather was a little overcast, the kind of gray sky that makes everything feel just a bit off. As I walked toward the door of the station, I noticed a man standing near one of the pumps. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a faded red jacket, a cap pulled low over his eyes, and jeans that looked like they'd seen better days. He gave me a friendly nod when he saw me, and I instinctively nodded back, though I wasn't really in the mood to chat. I'd been on the road for far too long and just wanted to get back home. But then he said something that made me stop in my tracks. "Hey, man, you look like you could use a wash." I stopped, frowning a little. Was he talking to me? I glanced at my car. It wasn't particularly dirty, but the long trip had left it a little dusty. Not enough to make me want to get a full wash, but enough to make me wonder if maybe it wouldn't hurt. "You sure you don't want a free wash while you're here?" he added. "Ah, free?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yep, free. Just trying to help out people like you on the road. Free wash, no strings attached." Something about it felt a little off, but at the same time, I figured it couldn't hurt. I had some time to kill, and if it was truly free, what was the worst that could happen? "All right," I said, pulling my keys out of my pocket. "Why not?" He gave me a smile that seemed almost too wide, like he was trying a bit too hard to seem friendly. Still, I didn't think much of it. I handed him my keys and started walking toward the convenience store to grab a drink. As I walked in, I could still see the man in my car, opening the door and starting to spray something on the windows. I didn't think it was weird at the time, but I should have been more cautious. It only took a minute before the unease started to creep in. I went straight to the cooler, grabbed a bottle of water, and walked up to the counter. The cashier gave me a look that I could only describe as uncomfortable, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just late and he was tired. But when I paid and turned around to head back outside, something felt wrong. The man with my car was gone. I froze, a chill running down my spine. My car was still there, but there was no sign of him anywhere. I glanced over at the other vehicles parked around the lot, but no one was paying attention. The gas station was still mostly empty. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe he was just washing my car in a different part of the lot. But my gut told me otherwise. I could feel my heart rate picking up. Something wasn't right. I started walking towards the exit, scanning the area for any sign of him. And then I saw it. The car. My car. It was moving. I saw it just as it sped out of the lot, tires screeching as it turned onto the highway. I froze. My legs felt like they were made of lead as the realization hit me. The man had stolen my car. I stood there, staring after it for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. It was like a bad dream, something that didn't feel real. I'd been gone for just a few minutes. How could he have taken my car that quickly? I didn't know what to do. I wanted to chase after him, but my legs wouldn't move. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and called the police. "They stole my car," I said, my voice trembling. "A man he just took my car." I was only inside for a minute. I could hear the dispatcher trying to calm me down, asking for my location and the details of the car. But all I could think about was how quickly it had happened. How had he done it? Was he just waiting for someone to leave their car unattended? Did he know exactly what he was doing? I walked back to the pump, staring at the empty spot where my car had been parked. The whole scene felt surreal. A couple of minutes later, the police arrived. They asked me to explain what had happened. I told them everything I could remember, but it didn't seem like much. I'd been inside for maybe 5 minutes, tops. When I came out, the car was gone. One officer asked if there was anything valuable in the car, but I couldn't think of anything in the moment. It wasn't like I had a lot of personal things in there, but I realized I didn't even know what the man had been able to take before he drove off. They asked me to wait while they filed the report. I didn't want to stick around any longer, so I left the station and went back to my hotel, my mind racing the entire time. How had he been able to take my car so easily? Was it a setup? Was it the kind of thing he did every night, preying on tired, unsuspecting drivers? The next day, the police called me to say they found the car abandoned at the side of the road. The thief had left it there, empty. I didn't get the car back until a few days later, after they finished collecting evidence. By then, I'd already canceled my insurance and filed a report with the DMV, assuming the worst. I still think about it sometimes. How easy it was for him to approach me, how quickly he had my car in his possession, and how no one at the gas station seemed to have seen anything. I never did find out who that man was or what he really wanted. Maybe it was just a one-off, maybe it wasn't. But now, every time I stop at a gas station, I'm more cautious. I never let anyone touch my keys unless I'm absolutely sure who they are. I should have trusted my instincts from the beginning. I had just finished a long day at work and wanted to grab a few things from the grocery store before heading home. It was late in the evening, around 8:30 p.m., and the store was quieter than usual, with only a handful of people scattered around the aisles. I was tired but just trying to get in and out as quickly as possible. I didn't think much of the empty shelves or the dimmed lights, just focused on my list and getting home. As I moved through the aisles, something caught my eye. A man was walking just a few paces behind me. I didn't pay much attention at first. It wasn't unusual to see people in the same aisles when you're picking out groceries. But then it happened again. I rounded the corner to the next aisle, and so did he, right behind me, just a few feet away. It wasn't anything too obvious, but I started to feel watched. A little uncomfortable. I picked up a box of cereal and glanced over my shoulder. He was still there. Not directly looking at me, but I could feel his presence. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I moved on, heading towards the produce section. I reached for some tomatoes and noticed him again, only this time he was standing a little too close to me. I could feel the air shift, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickly looked down at my cart, pretending to rummage through it. He was still there, and this time, it wasn't subtle. I kept telling myself to stay calm. This was a grocery store, after all. People shop, and maybe he was just trying to pick up some items too. But the way he was lingering was starting to feel wrong. I didn't recognize him from the store, and I couldn't remember seeing him earlier in the aisles. I kept glancing around the store, trying to see if anyone else had noticed him, but no one seemed to be paying attention. It was just the two of us, and I began to feel like I was trapped in some kind of vacuum, the space around me growing smaller with every step I took. I grabbed what I needed, trying to keep moving, trying to stay focused on my list. But each time I turned down a new aisle, there he was always just a few steps behind. Sometimes he would stop, pretending to look at a shelf, and then start walking again when I did. At one point, I reached for a bag of flour, and when I straightened up, he was right there. Too close. "Excuse me," I muttered, trying to sound confident, though my voice was shaking slightly. He just smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was unsettling, almost as if he knew something I didn't. "Sorry," he said, his voice flat. He stepped aside, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than was comfortable before he moved to the next aisle. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart started pounding in my chest. I hurried to finish my shopping, grabbing the last few items as quickly as I could, trying not to glance back. I just wanted to get to the checkout, get out of there, and go home. When I finally made my way to the register, I noticed the man again, standing in line a few spots behind me. This time, I made sure not to look back at him, but I could feel his presence, like a shadow on the back of my neck. I paid quickly, practically running through the checkout process. The cashier didn't seem to notice anything, or maybe they were just too busy with their own work. I didn't care. I left the store, trying to stay calm, to look casual. My mind was racing, and I could hear my footsteps echoing on the pavement as I walked to my car. It wasn't until I reached the end of the row that I saw him again, standing by his car, just a few spots over from mine. My stomach dropped. I couldn't remember what kind of car he drove, but there it was, a sedan with tinted windows, parked next to my own. I didn't know for sure if he was waiting for me, but something told me that he was. I stopped in my tracks. I didn't want to seem like I was panicking, but I could feel the dread creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't just go back into the store. I couldn't go back to the register and make a scene. I needed to get to my car, but I was too scared to walk towards it now. I stood there for a moment, pretending to adjust my purse and looking around to see if anyone else was still in the parking lot. The place was nearly empty now. I could see a couple of cars far off in the distance, but no one close. The parking lot was eerily quiet. My pulse was thudding in my ears. I checked my phone quickly, no messages. No calls. I glanced back at the man. He was still standing there, facing away from me, but I knew he had to have seen me by now. He hadn't gotten into his car. He hadn't moved an inch. Just waiting. Watching. I thought about calling someone, but my hands were shaking. I didn't want to make any rash decisions and risk alerting him that I was onto him. I tried to breathe through the anxiety rising in my chest. I could feel the panic beginning to build, but I forced myself to move. Slowly, I stepped back toward my car, making my way down the row of vehicles, keeping my eyes fixed ahead of me. I felt like every step took forever. When I was just a few feet away from my car, I hesitated. Was he really going to do something? Was he just waiting for me to get close enough? I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I had to get in my car, fast. I reached for my keys, keeping my eyes fixed on his car. I unlocked the door and slid inside, locking it immediately. My hands were still shaking, and I could barely get the key into the ignition. I glanced in my rearview mirror, but the parking lot was empty. He wasn't there anymore. My heart was racing in my chest as I finally started the engine and backed out of the space. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. It wasn't until I got inside my apartment and locked the door that I felt like I could breathe again. But even then, I kept thinking about that man. The way he followed me, the way he just stood there waiting by his car. The sick feeling in my stomach didn't go away until well into the night. I didn't go out again alone for the next few days. I stayed home, and even when I did go out, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching me. I don't know if that man was just looking for someone to talk to or if he had other intentions, but I wasn't willing to stick around long enough to find out. I never thought much about picking up hitchhikers, but it was late, and the rain had started coming down hard. I was driving back from a business trip, and I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The roads were quiet, and I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me because of the rain. Then, on the side of the road, I saw him just standing there, drenched, thumb out, staring into the headlights. I debated for a second. Normally, I wouldn't stop, but something made me pull over. Maybe it was the way he looked. He seemed harmless, just a guy in his mid-30s, with a rain-soaked jacket and a tired face. I rolled down the window a bit. "You need a ride?" I asked. He nodded quickly, stepping toward the car. "Yeah, please. I've been waiting for a while." I unlocked the door, and he slid in. He thanked me as he shut the door, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Just past Clearwater," he said, looking out the window. "I'll get off soon. Just need to get out of the rain." "Clearwater?" "That's a couple hours away," I said, but I didn't mind. It was getting late, and I'd rather have some company on the road than not. We were the only two cars on the highway, and the rain wasn't showing any sign of stopping. "Yeah," he said, looking back at me. "I've got a friend out there. He's expecting me." His voice was calm, maybe a bit too calm for someone who had just been standing out in the pouring rain for who knows how long. I nodded and kept driving. For the next 20 minutes, there was silence between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, but there was something strange about him. He didn't seem to mind the quiet, and every so often, I'd catch him looking at me, like he was studying me. "You from around here?" he asked after a while. "No, just passing through," I replied. "Work trip?" He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting back to the window. "Yeah, me too. Just passing through. Gotta get somewhere important." I didn't know why, but something about that made me uneasy. It was like the way he said it, like he was hiding something. I kept my focus on the road, trying not to let my mind wander. After about another 10 minutes, I heard him shift in his seat. I glanced over and saw him looking at me, but his expression was different now. Harder. It wasn't that friendly face anymore. His eyes were cold. "You know," he said, his voice low, "you didn't really have to stop, you know. You didn't have to pick me up." I felt a little chill run down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. "You looked like you needed help," I said, glancing at him for a second before focusing back on the road. "I don't need anyone's help," he said, and now there was a sharpness to his voice. It wasn't the same person who had gotten into the car a while ago. "I just needed a ride, and now I'm stuck with you." I didn't know what to say. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe he was just a little too tired or maybe he'd had a rough day. "It's all right," I said, trying to lighten the mood. Just trying to be friendly. He didn't respond. The air in the car had shifted. It wasn't the rain anymore, but something about the way he was sitting in his seat, his eyes locked on me, made the car feel smaller. He was still staring at me, unblinking. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "You should probably get out when we hit the next exit," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't move. Didn't say a word for a long time. I glanced at him, just as the headlights cut through the rain. "Hey," I said. Before I could finish, he suddenly reached forward, grabbing the door handle like he was about to throw it open. I swerved to the side, almost hitting the guardrail. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to regain control of the car. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice shaking now. He let go of the handle, but he was still staring at me, his face twisted into something I couldn't quite read. "You think I'm just gonna let you tell me what to do? You think I'm just gonna get out when you say so?" The rain was pounding harder now, and the headlights barely cut through it. I tried to focus on the road, my hands slipping on the wheel. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I said, my voice shaky. "You're not as nice as you think," he muttered. "You pick me up, so you deal with me now." I was starting to panic, but I tried not to show it. I didn't want to make him angrier. "I'll pull over at the next exit," I said. "You can get out there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back in his seat and chuckled. It wasn't a laugh, it was a low, eerie sound, like he was mocking me. "You think I'm gonna get out? After all this?" I looked at him again, this time fully aware of the danger. He wasn't planning on leaving. I knew it then, but I wasn't sure what to do. "You need to get out," I said again, my voice firm, but my heart was racing. But now he just grinned. It was a slow, deliberate smile, and something in it made me want to vomit. "You don't get it, do you?" "I'm not getting out," he said. I was trembling now, but I wasn't about to let him have control. I quickly reached for my phone, planning to call for help, but before I could do anything, he reached across the seat and grabbed my wrist. His fingers were like iron, digging into my skin. "You can't just call someone," he hissed. I yanked my wrist away, my mind racing. I had to think fast. I couldn't let him control this situation. I focused on the road, trying to remain calm, even though panic was rising inside me. I remembered the gun I kept in the glove box. I had never used it, but I had it there for situations like this. He must have seen the shift in my expression because he leaned forward, his face inches from mine. "You think that'll help?" he whispered, his breath hot and rank in my face. But before I could react, I saw the lights of another car in the distance. Relief flooded me, and for a split second, I thought I might get out of this alive. The car was close, and I steered toward it. My foot slammed on the gas, and I cut across 2 lanes to get behind the other vehicle. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the hitchhiker still watching me, his eyes burning into the back of my skull. I wasn't safe yet, but I was getting closer. I couldn't go back to the road we'd been on, but I could keep driving. I had to keep driving, away from him, away from whatever the hell he had planned. When I finally found a gas station and stopped, I jumped out of the car, locked the doors, and ran inside. I didn't stop until I was inside, safe. The stranger never followed me inside, but I swear I saw him standing outside in the rain, watching me through the window. It was late, maybe around 9 or 10 p.m., when my car broke down on Route 17. I was headed back home after visiting my sister, and it was one of those stretches of highway with nothing but fields and trees on either side. The nearest town was at least 20 miles back, and my phone had barely a single bar of service. I was trying not to panic, but the thought of sitting there all night wasn't exactly comforting. I popped the hood and stared at the engine like I knew what I was looking at. I didn't. Everything seemed fine to me, but the car wouldn't start. The battery was new, and I had gas, so I couldn't figure out what the problem was. I tried calling for roadside assistance, but the call wouldn't go through. That's when I saw the headlights. They came up slow, like whoever was driving was being careful. I stood by my car, waving my arms to make sure they saw me. A truck pulled over to the side, an older model, maybe from the 80s or 90s. The driver got out, a tall man with a thick build, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had a calm, steady way about him. "You all right?" he asked, his voice deep and even. "My car just died," I said. "I can't figure out what's wrong, and my phone's not working." He nodded and walked over to my car without another word. He leaned over the engine, fiddling with a couple of things while I stood off to the side. After a minute, he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag from his pocket. "Looks like it might be the fuel pump," he said. "You're not going anywhere tonight." I felt my stomach drop. What should I do? "Well," he said, "I've got a garage not far from here." I can tow you there. Take a closer look. I hesitated. Something about him made me uneasy, but I didn't have many options. It was either him or wait for someone else to come by, and who knew how long that would take. "All right," I said finally. He went back to his truck and pulled out a tow chain, hooking it up to my car. The whole time, he didn't say much. I tried to make small talk, asking if he lived nearby, but his answers were short, almost clipped. The ride to his garage wasn't long, maybe 10 minutes, but it felt longer. We turned off the main road onto a dirt path that wound through the trees. There weren't any lights except for his headlights, and the further we went, the darker it got. I started to regret my decision, but it was too late to back out. The garage was a small, run-down building with peeling paint and a single overhead light that flickered. He unhooked my car and waved me toward the entrance. "Come on in," he said. "I'll take a look." I followed him inside, and my unease grew. The place was cluttered with old tools, car parts, and a thick layer of dust. There was a smell, too oil mixed with something sour. He motioned for me to sit on a worn-out chair near the wall while he pulled the hood of my car open again. I tried to stay calm, but the way he moved felt off. He wasn't really looking at the engine, just sort of going through the motions. I noticed his eyes darting toward me every so often, like he was checking to see if I was watching him. "Do you have any family nearby?" he asked suddenly. "No," I said. "Why?" "Just making conversation," he said, his tone flat. I shifted in my seat, feeling the tension in the air. I glanced toward the door, calculating how far I'd have to run to get to it if something went wrong. He closed the hood and turned to face me. "Fuel pump shot," he said. "I can order the part, but it'll take a day or two." "I can call someone to pick me up," I said, standing. "Thanks for your help." "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold now. "Your phone doesn't work, remember?" I froze. The way he said it wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement. I forced myself to smile, trying to act like I wasn't scared. "I'll just wait outside," I said, moving toward the door. He stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "You're staying here," he said. "It's not safe out there at night." My heart was pounding now. I tried to step around him, but he grabbed my arm. His grip was strong, and his eyes had a strange intensity. "Let go of me," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't. Instead, he pulled me back toward the chair and pushed me into it. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. I didn't wait to see what he meant. I twisted out of his grip and ran for the door. He shouted something behind me, but I didn't stop. I made it outside and sprinted toward the trees. My legs were burning, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel. He was faster than I expected, and I knew I couldn't outrun him. I spotted a thick cluster of bushes and dove into them, crouching low and trying to quiet my breathing. He stopped nearby, his footsteps slowing. I could hear him muttering to himself, his voice low and angry. He walked past my hiding spot, and I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore before I moved. I crept through the trees, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights in the distance. I ran toward the road and flagged down a passing car. The driver was an older woman, and she took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She didn't ask questions, just told me to get in. She drove me to the nearest town, where I called the police. They found my car at the garage, but the man was gone. They said the place had been abandoned for years, and they'd had reports of strange activity in the area before. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but I've never driven that stretch of highway again. I always liked running early in the morning. It was quiet, the air felt fresh, and the streets were mostly empty. My usual route took me through a small park about a mile from my apartment. It wasn't big, just a couple of winding paths, some benches, and a lot of trees, but it was peaceful, especially at that time of day. I'd been running there for months and never had any issues. That morning felt like any other. It was just past 5:30 a.m., and the sun was barely starting to rise. I had my usual playlist going, the one I always used to get into a rhythm. The streets were still dark, and the only people I saw were the occasional dog walkers or another runner here and there. When I reached the park, I turned onto the main path, letting my feet fall into their usual pace. I noticed him about halfway through the park. He was standing near a bench, just off the path. At first, I thought he was waiting for someone. He wasn't doing anything, no phone, no dog, nothing. Just standing there, looking straight ahead. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about the way he stood caught my attention. Too still. Too rigid. I kept running, telling myself not to overthink it. Plenty of people use the park, and not everyone looks friendly first thing in the morning. As I got closer, I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He wasn't looking straight ahead anymore. He was looking at me. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept going. I didn't slow down, didn't change my pace. Just kept running. My music was still playing, but I turned the volume down low so I could hear if he said or did anything. He didn't move as I passed, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. About 20 steps past him, I looked over my shoulder, trying to be casual about it. He was still standing there, but now he had turned around. He was watching me. I told myself to focus. It was early, and maybe he was just out for a walk and curious about someone running by. I'd seen plenty of people in the park who seemed out of place. It didn't mean anything. But then I heard it, footsteps. At first, I thought it might just be someone else entering the park from another direction. I told myself not to panic, not to assume. But when I glanced back again, I saw him. He was walking now, heading in the same direction I was. Not running, not rushing. Just walking. He wasn't close, maybe 50 feet behind me, but he was there. I sped up a little, trying to create more distance between us. I told myself to stick to my route, not to change anything. If he was just walking, I'd be out of the park before he could get anywhere near me. I reached the end of the path and took the usual left turn toward the exit. When I glanced back again, he had turned too. My heart was pounding now, harder than it should have been from just running. I wasn't winded, but I felt like I couldn't breathe. I told myself to stay calm, to keep running, to act like nothing was wrong. But every time I looked back, he was still there. Always just far enough that it felt like I couldn't say anything or confront him, but close enough that I couldn't shake him. When I finally exited the park, I felt a small wave of relief. The street ahead was wider, brighter. A few cars passed by, their headlights cutting through the early morning gloom. I thought about stopping, waiting for him to pass, but something told me that would be worse. I didn't want him to know I was scared. I kept running, heading toward the busier part of my route. There was a gas station about a quarter mile up. It was small, but the lights were always on, and there was usually someone inside. I decided I'd stop there if he was still following me. I didn't have to look back anymore. I could hear his footsteps now. They were steady, matching my pace. Not speeding up, not slowing down. Just following. When I reached the gas station, I didn't hesitate. I turned sharply and went straight inside. The man behind the counter looked up, surprised to see someone this early. I walked to the back, pretending to grab a bottle of water, but really just trying to catch my breath. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I stayed back there for a minute or two before glancing toward the door. He was standing outside. He wasn't looking in, just standing by the edge of the parking lot, like he was waiting for me to come out. His hands were in his pockets, and his head was tilted slightly, like he was listening for something. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the gas station forever, but I didn't want to leave while he was still there. The man behind the counter asked if I needed help, and I almost told him what was going on. But what could he do? Call the police because someone was walking behind me? After a few minutes, the man outside moved. He didn't leave, just shifted closer to the building, standing by the corner where I couldn't see him unless I walked out. That's when I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I walked to the counter and told the clerk there was a man outside who had been following me. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the fear in it. The clerk frowned, looking toward the door, then nodded. He told me to stay inside while he went to check. I watched as he stepped out, looking around. The man was gone. The clerk came back in and told me there was no one there, but I could tell he believed me. He asked if I needed him to call someone or if I wanted to wait for a ride. I nodded, pulling out my phone to call a friend. I didn't care that it was early. I just needed someone to pick me up. While I waited, I stayed near the counter, my eyes glued to the parking lot. My friend showed up about 10 minutes later, and I ran straight to their car, not looking back. I told them everything on the ride home, and they insisted on staying with me for the rest of the day. I didn't go running for a while after that. When I finally did, I chose a different route, one with more people and fewer places to hide. But even now, I can't shake the feeling of those footsteps behind me, steady and deliberate, like they were waiting for something. Like he was waiting for something. I still don't know how I ended up in that situation. I tell myself I made the wrong turn or took the wrong path, but the truth is, I should have just stayed in my tent. If I had, maybe none of this would have happened. It all started like any other solo camping trip. I had set up camp in a remote area of the forest, a place I'd found while researching spots online. The weather was perfect, and it had been a few days of peaceful solitude. I spent my time hiking, reading, and enjoying the quiet. But on the third evening, things took a turn. I had gone out for a short evening walk to stretch my legs. My plan was to wander a little further along the trail and then turn back before nightfall. I wasn't planning to go far, but when the sun began to set, I took a path I didn't recognize. The woods here were dense and overgrown, and the fading light made everything look different than it had earlier in the day. Still, I wasn't too concerned. I'd hiked a lot, and I had a decent sense of direction. Then, I heard voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but it was too distinct to be that. It was talking, clear as day. I moved toward the sound, thinking maybe it was another hiker or a group of campers nearby. As I got closer, I spotted them, 4 people standing in a small clearing near the base of a large oak tree. I couldn't see their faces at first, but they were all standing still, facing each other. Their voices were low, but they seemed to be in conversation. I stepped closer, calling out a friendly greeting. I wasn't nervous yet. I thought maybe they were just resting or taking a break from hiking. "Hey there," I said, trying to sound casual. "You folks out here for a hike?" One of them turned to face me, a man in his early 30s, I guess. He smiled, but it was odd. It wasn't the kind of smile I expected. It didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just passing through," he said, his voice calm but flat. I didn't think much of it at the time. I introduced myself, and they introduced themselves in turn. There was another man, a woman, and a teenage boy with them. They all seemed nice enough. They told me they were hikers from a nearby town and had just been out for a few days, doing a little trail exploration. They weren't far from where I'd set up camp, they said, but they had no plans to stay for long. We talked for a while, but there was something off about it. The conversation didn't flow the way it usually does with strangers. It felt a little stilted, like they weren't really listening to me. They mostly talked amongst themselves, and their words felt rehearsed, as if they had practiced them before. The silence between the words made me feel uncomfortable, but I kept telling myself I was overthinking things. I was alone in the woods, and maybe I just wasn't used to company. After a while, the sun had almost completely set, and I felt the chill of the night settling in. I knew it was time to leave, so I said my goodbyes and started to walk back toward my camp. But before I could go, the man who had spoken to me earlier said something odd. "Hey, if you want to join us for the night, you're welcome. We've got a fire going," he said, gesturing toward a small campfire behind them. At that point, I didn't really want to stay, but something about his offer felt polite, I guess. I don't know. It wasn't like I had any real reason to refuse, so I agreed, telling myself that I could leave at any time. We walked back to their camp together. It was a little further from the clearing where I'd met them, hidden behind some thick trees. They had a small fire going in the middle of their camp, surrounded by some logs that they used for sitting. The group didn't say much after we arrived. They just sat around the fire, staring into it. There was no conversation, no laughter, nothing to suggest the kind of warm, campfire atmosphere you'd expect. I tried to start a few casual conversations, asking about their hike and where they were headed, but their answers were curt and almost mechanical. The longer I sat there, the more unsettled I became. The air felt too still, the fire too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man I had spoken to earlier, his name was Aaron, I think stayed silent for a long time. His gaze was locked on the fire, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The others didn't move either. They just stared at the fire, their faces shadowed in the flickering light. Even the teenage boy didn't say a word. Then, without warning, the silence broke. "We should start now," Aaron said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Start what?" I thought. I didn't have the chance to ask, because he stood up abruptly and began walking toward the edge of the camp. The others followed without a word. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I should leave or follow them. Part of me was telling me to leave, but another part of me felt compelled to stay, to understand what was going on. I decided to follow them. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the weird vibe I was getting from them, but I had to know what they were up to. They moved quietly, like shadows, into the woods. I kept my distance, watching them as they walked. Their steps were slow, deliberate, as if they were in no rush. After a while, we came to a small clearing, where they stopped and faced each other. Aaron spoke again, but this time, his voice was different. It was almost like he was reciting something. "The ritual must be complete," he said, his eyes still fixed on the firelight. The others nodded in unison. My heart started to race as I watched them. Something wasn't right. What followed made my skin crawl. They began moving in a circle, walking slowly around the clearing. At first, I thought they were just doing some kind of weird dance, but the longer I watched, the more it became clear that it was something far stranger. It was like they were following some kind of pattern, some kind of ritual. The air felt thick, like something was building, but I couldn't place what it was. I took a step back, my breathing shallow. My instincts told me to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't tear myself away. I don't know why. Maybe I was frozen with fear, Or maybe it was the fact that I knew if I left, they'd notice. They'd find me. But I didn't leave. Instead, I stayed hidden in the trees, watching them continue their strange movements. They kept circling around, their steps in sync, and every now and then, Aaron would mutter something that I couldn't understand. The whole thing felt like a performance, a ritual that had been rehearsed for a long time. Finally, when I couldn't take it any longer, I turned and ran. I didn't look back, I just ran. I don't know if they saw me leave, but I didn't care. I was miles away from their camp before I slowed down to catch my breath. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't want to stick around, didn't want to know if they were still out there. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not at first. Who would believe me? But every time I go camping, every time I'm out in the woods, I wonder, what were they doing? What were they trying to do? I don't know. I don't think I ever want to know. It was supposed to be a simple hike. I had planned the route carefully, packed light, and set out early enough to make it back before dark. The weather forecast had called for scattered clouds and the occasional light drizzle, but nothing that would make the trail dangerous. I should have known better, though. It's always the unexpected things that get you. The rain started coming down around mid-afternoon. At first, it was just a few drops here and there, nothing to worry about. But then the sky opened up. It went from light showers to a downpour in minutes. The kind of rain that drenches you completely, making everything slippery and slick. I figured it was best to find some shelter until it passed, but the trail didn't have much in the way of cover. There were no large trees, and the few small ones couldn't offer enough protection. I kept walking, hoping it would let up, but it didn't. After about 30 minutes of slogging through the wet mud, I spotted something through the trees, a cabin. I didn't know how far I was from the nearest town, but I knew it was probably someone's hunting cabin. The place didn't look like it was being used, and there was no sign of life, but it was a shelter. That was enough for me. I figured I'd just take a quick break and wait for the rain to ease up. I approached the cabin cautiously. There was no one around, and the place looked like it had been abandoned for years, covered in moss, with the wood starting to rot in spots. Still, it would keep me dry. I walked up to the door and tried the handle. To my surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, hoping no one would show up to kick me out. The inside was small, one room with a small fireplace and a dusty table in the middle. It looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. I shrugged it off. It was just a storm, and I needed a dry spot to sit for a while. So, I closed the door behind me, took off my jacket, and shook off as much water as I could. I could hear the rain pounding against the roof, and the wind howling outside, but at least I was warm. About 15 minutes passed. I was beginning to think the storm was going to stick around for a while when I heard a noise outside. At first, it was just a faint sound, maybe the wind, or a branch breaking in the trees. But then I heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps, like someone was walking up to the cabin. My heart jumped in my chest. I didn't think anyone else was out here. It was too remote. The trail was empty when I started, and I hadn't seen anyone for hours. I held my breath and listened, trying to figure out if I had heard what I thought I had. The footsteps were getting closer. I froze, unsure of what to do. I wasn't supposed to be here. The cabin didn't look like it was meant for anyone but the person who owned it, and I wasn't about to get caught trespassing. Then I heard the door handle rattle. My blood ran cold. I quickly ducked behind the table, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The door creaked open, and I heard someone step inside. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just anyone. The man who walked in was wearing a long coat, his boots heavy against the floorboards. He was soaked, like he'd been out in the rain longer than I had. The door closed behind him with a thud. I stayed still, hoping he wouldn't notice me. I didn't know who he was, but I had a bad feeling. I wasn't supposed to be here, and now I was trapped. The storm outside was worse than ever, and there was no way I was going to make it back to the trail without getting drenched. But that didn't matter right now. The man in the cabin was a problem. He didn't speak for a while. Just stood there, probably shaking off the rain. I tried to stay as quiet as possible, hoping he wouldn't notice me crouched behind the table. But then he spoke. "What the hell are you doing in my cabin?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. His voice was low, rough, almost as if he didn't expect anyone to be here. I could hear the anger in his tone. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaky. "I was just looking for shelter from the rain. I didn't mean to intrude." There was a long pause, and I could hear him breathing. Then he laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was dark, almost mocking. "Shelter? This is my place, you idiot. You think you can just walk in here like you own the damn place?" His voice rose, and I could hear him stepping closer. I stood up, my hands raised. "I swear, I didn't know it was yours. I just needed to get out of the rain." He didn't respond. I could hear his heavy footsteps now, moving across the floor. I could feel his presence coming closer, like he was circling me. I had to make a decision, stay and talk my way out of this, or bolt and risk getting caught. Before I could do anything, he was right in front of me. I backed up a step, but he grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful. "You don't just come into someone's home without permission. You understand that?" he growled. I tried to pull away, but his hand wouldn't budge. His fingers dug into my skin, and I was starting to panic. I had no idea what this guy was going to do. The thought of being trapped in a cabin with an angry man out in the middle of nowhere was terrifying. "I'll leave. Just let me go," I pleaded, my voice trembling. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Then he seemed to relax a little. "Not so fast," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "You're not just walking out of here. Not until we've had a little chat." I was stuck. There was nowhere to go. The door was still behind him, but I didn't think I could get past him without a struggle. And there was no one around for miles. The storm was still raging outside, and the night was pitch black. If I ran, he could catch me easily. I had no choice. I needed to try and get out, somehow. But this guy wasn't going to make it easy. My mind raced for a way to calm him down, to get him to let go of my arm, but I couldn't think clearly. Every part of me screamed to just leave, but I had no idea how far the road was, how long it would take to find help. And then, just as I thought things couldn't get worse, the door creaked open again. Another figure stepped inside. This one was younger, and they looked just as drenched as the man. Their eyes met mine, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flash of sympathy. Then they quickly looked down at the floor, avoiding any eye contact. "Is everything okay?" the younger person asked, voice uncertain. The older man's grip on my arm loosened just a little, but he didn't answer right away. I used that moment to slip out of his grasp, backing away slowly. "I'm leaving. I don't want any trouble. I'm just looking for shelter. Please." To my relief, the older man didn't stop me this time. His eyes were still cold, but he didn't reach for me again. He just stood there, watching as I backed toward the door. I ran out into the rain without looking back, not waiting for any kind of answer, not caring if he called after me. I kept running until I found a road, then kept walking, not stopping until I finally reached a town. I didn't stop to talk to anyone about it. I didn't want to explain what happened in that cabin, but I'll never forget it. That feeling of being trapped in a place with someone who wanted nothing more than to hurt you, and the terror of knowing there was no one around to stop him. I still wonder what would have happened if that second person hadn't shown up when they did. I had been living in my house for a couple of years when I decided it was time for a change. The kitchen was outdated, and the bathroom needed work. I'd heard about a contractor from a friend who had done some remodeling in her home and recommended him. He seemed professional when we met, and his references checked out. I felt comfortable hiring him to do the job. I work long hours, so I figured it would be easier for him to come by during the day while I was at work. He was going to handle everything, the demo, the construction, and all the finishing touches. I trusted him to do a good job, but I didn't think much of it when I left for work every day. I was busy, and I had other things on my mind. The first few days went smoothly. He showed up early, worked long hours, and left when I got home. The house looked like a mess with all the construction, but I figured that was just part of the process. After a week or so, the kitchen cabinets were out, the counters were being replaced, and the walls had been stripped down. It was messy, but it was clear he was making progress. But then things started to feel off. I had a feeling that something wasn't right when I came home one evening and found my bedroom door slightly open. I had never left it open, and it wasn't like I had forgotten. I'm not someone who leaves doors open unless I'm in and out of a room. The rest of the house was just as I had left it, so I didn't think much of it at the time. The next day, I came home and found the same thing. My bedroom door was ajar, and I could have sworn I had closed it. I started to feel uneasy but told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was forgetful. Maybe the door didn't latch properly, or maybe I had left it open without thinking. I tried to dismiss it, but it kept happening. Every day, I'd come home to find my bedroom door open, and sometimes other rooms felt slightly different. The couch cushions were arranged differently, or a picture frame that I hadn't touched was crooked. Little things that didn't make sense. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or if something strange was really going on. But every time I walked into the house, I felt a chill in the air, like someone else had been there. Then one evening, I had an idea. I'd started working from home occasionally, so I decided to stay in the house and keep an eye on things. I made sure to close my bedroom door before I left for work. I wanted to see if anything changed while I was gone. That evening, when I came home, I opened the door slowly, and my stomach dropped. It was open. Wide open. I stood there, frozen, trying to figure out what was going on. I had clearly locked it before leaving, and now it was wide open, just like the other times. I went inside, checking for anything else that was out of place. That's when I noticed the camera. It was small, hidden on the corner of the room, nearly impossible to see unless you were specifically looking for it. I felt sick. My hands were shaking. My first thought was to call the police, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it wasn't what I thought it was. But I knew I had to get confirmation before doing anything drastic. The next morning, I made sure to leave the camera exactly where it was. I left for work as usual, but this time I went to the local store and bought a few things. I wasn't sure what I was planning to do, but I had to know. I wanted to see if there were more cameras in the house. I came back that evening, pretending everything was normal. I went straight to my bedroom and checked the camera again. Sure enough, it had been moved. The angle was slightly different, as though someone had been adjusting it while I was gone. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I was being watched. I was sure of it now. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to trust. I knew I couldn't confront him just yet. What if he denied it? What if it escalated? I had to be careful. But I had no idea how deep this had gone or how long it had been going on. I knew he'd been in my house when I wasn't there, but I couldn't figure out how long this had been happening. The next day, I took the camera to a friend who worked in tech. I told her what had been happening and showed her the footage. It was unmistakable. He had been recording me. He had been watching my every move when I was at home, when I was alone. My worst fears were coming true. He had been in my personal space, invading my privacy for God knows how long. I called the police that night. I told them everything. They came to the house, and we looked through the footage together. There were hours of recordings, me walking around the house, sitting on the couch, making dinner, even moments when I was changing clothes. I felt disgusted, violated, like everything I had was no longer mine. The worst part was not knowing how long he'd been doing this. How many times had he watched me when I was completely unaware? The police didn't waste any time. They went to his office, and they found more cameras, more hidden equipment. Apparently, he had been doing this to other clients as well. I couldn't believe it. I felt like I had been living in a nightmare. Someone I had trusted to do work in my house had turned out to be someone I should have never let through my door. I never saw him again after that day. I don't know what happened to him, but I know he was arrested and charged with multiple offenses. It's been months now, and I still don't feel safe in my own house. I've had all the locks changed and the security system upgraded. But no matter what I do, I can't stop feeling like I'm being watched. Like I'm never really alone. I've been trying to move on, but some days it's harder than others. I still check my bedroom door, even though I know it's locked. And sometimes, I wonder how many people out there are doing the same thing he did to me, hiding in plain sight. We moved into our new house in early spring. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood you'd expect to find a house like ours in, but the price was right, and the house had everything we needed. The kids were excited, and my wife, Liz, was looking forward to making a fresh start after the chaos of the past year. We'd been through a lot, moving to a new town, settling into a new job, all that, but it felt like this could be a new chapter for us. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were friendly, and the kids quickly made friends with some of the other children in the area. Liz met a few of the local moms, and they were eager to have her over for coffee. It felt like the kind of place where people looked out for each other, which was exactly what we needed. But there was one neighbor, the one next door, who gave me a bad feeling from the start. His name was Doug. He lived alone, which I didn't think much of at first, but there was something unsettling about him. He always seemed to be watching us, even when we weren't doing anything out of the ordinary. The first time we met him, he just walked across the yard to introduce himself, but he stood there too long, staring at me and Liz with this strange smile. I chalked it up to being awkward, but it stuck with me. At first, it wasn't anything major. Just small things. He'd wave from his porch, but then stand there staring while we got the kids into the car. He'd be outside when I came home from work, as if he had been waiting for me to pull into the driveway. He'd strike up these long, drawn-out conversations about the weather, or the neighborhood, or whatever. I tried to be polite, but it was like he was trying too hard to insert himself into our lives. Liz started to notice it too. She'd mention how strange it was that Doug seemed to always be home whenever we were, like he was watching for when we come outside. She made a joke about it at first, but then she started to get uncomfortable. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I was overthinking things. It wasn't until about a month into living there that the weirdness really started. One evening, Liz and I were sitting in the living room, watching a movie. The kids were upstairs, and the house was quiet. Around 9 p.m., I noticed a shadow in the front yard. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but when I looked out the window, I saw Doug standing in his driveway, staring directly at our house. I thought it was odd, but maybe he was just taking a walk or something. I told Liz, and she didn't think much of it either. A couple of nights later, it happened again. This time, I went outside to check the mail, and Doug came over. He didn't even wait for me to come up to him. He just started talking, asking about the house and how we liked it. I gave him short answers, but he kept going on, telling me things about the neighborhood, about the previous owners of the house, about how quiet it was here. But he wasn't looking at me when he spoke. His eyes were darting around, like he was checking for something or someone. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude, so I just nodded along. Things took a darker turn the following week. Liz and I were getting ready to go out for a date night. We had hired a sitter, and everything was set. But when I went out to start the car, I noticed something strange. Doug's garage door was open, and his car was parked inside, but the lights in his house were off. The windows were completely dark. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I turned around to get into my car, I saw Doug standing in his driveway again, staring at me. I got this chill down my spine. It wasn't just a casual glance. He was looking at me with an intensity one hadn't noticed before. It was like he was watching, waiting. I rushed to the car, locked the doors, and started it up. I didn't say anything to Liz right away, but I felt the tension in the air as I drove out of the driveway. It was like Doug was waiting for something, like he had been anticipating my every move. I brushed it off as paranoia. We went out, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night when we came home, the house was quiet, but something felt off. Liz mentioned it first. "Did you leave the porch light on?" she asked. I hadn't. I checked, and sure enough, the light was on. I went outside to turn it off and noticed that the gate to our backyard was slightly open, even though we had locked it earlier. I had no idea how it had happened, but that was when I realized something wasn't right. Doug had been at the center of everything. I couldn't prove it, but the sense of being watched was growing stronger each day. Liz noticed things too. Small things, like her gardening tools being moved, or our front door slightly ajar when we were sure we'd locked it. I started checking the windows and doors every night before bed, but it felt like no matter how careful we were, someone was always a step ahead of us. It came to a head a week later. I was home alone one afternoon, working from my office. I got up to make coffee, and as I passed by the window, I saw Doug standing on the edge of his porch, staring at me through the window. I froze, but he didn't move. He just kept watching, as if waiting for me to notice him. I pulled the blinds down quickly and backed away from the window, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and called Liz, but she didn't pick up. I tried again. Nothing. Then I heard the sound of footsteps on my porch. I didn't have to look to know it was him. I could feel it. My blood ran cold as I heard Doug's voice, muffled through the door. "You're home alone, aren't you?" he asked, his voice soft, almost playful. I grabbed the nearest thing to me, a lamp, and I stood still, listening. The door handle rattled, and I could hear Doug's voice again. "I know you're there. I've been waiting for you." I didn't know what to do. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. My mind raced, but all I could think was to get out of the house. I ran upstairs and grabbed the kids, told them to stay quiet and hide in the closet. I didn't know if Doug had any intention of harming us, but I wasn't going to risk finding out. I called the police, my hands shaking, and within minutes, I heard their sirens. When they arrived, Doug was gone. They searched the property and surrounding areas, but there was no sign of him. They told me there was nothing they could do unless we had concrete evidence of harassment or a threat, and without that, they couldn't press charges. We moved out within the week. I didn't feel safe anymore, and neither did Liz. I don't know what Doug wanted, but I couldn't stick around to find out. After we left, I found out from a neighbor that Doug had lived alone for years and had a history of bizarre behavior. Apparently, he didn't like new neighbors moving in. They said he'd been trying to get the house next door to ours for a long time. I'll never understand why he acted the way he did, but I'm just glad we got out. Every time I think back to that house, to Doug, I can't help but feel like we narrowly escaped something much worse. I used to work as a delivery driver for a company that handled large shipments. Most of the time, it was easy work to pick up the package, drop it off, get a signature, and move on to the next stop. The night it happened, I had one last delivery on my route. The warehouse was way out of town, on an industrial road that was mostly empty. I'd been there a few times before. The place was always quiet, just a few guys working late shifts, unloading trucks or organizing pallets. The package I was delivering wasn't unusual. Just a long, rectangular crate about 6 feet tall. The thing that stuck out was the weight. It was heavier than anything I'd moved that week. I had to use the dolly to get it onto the truck, and when I stopped at the warehouse, it took all my strength to roll it to the loading dock. The dock door was open when I arrived, but the lights inside were dim. I called out, but no one answered at first. After a minute, a guy came around the corner. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days, dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his face. He wasn't wearing any uniform, just a plain jacket and jeans. "You're late," he said, not looking at me. I told him I had other stops, but he didn't seem to care. He just pointed to the crate and said, "Bring it in." I pushed the dolly into the warehouse. It was colder inside than I expected, and it smelled bad, like chemicals and something rotting. The guy led me to a corner where a few more men were standing. There were 4 of them total, all dressed the same, jackets, work boots, no uniforms. They didn't say much, just nodded at the crate and motioned for me to leave it there. One of them handed me a clipboard to sign. I noticed his hands were dirty, like he'd been working with oil or grease, but there was something else on them too. Something darker. It wasn't grease, it looked like blood. I signed the paperwork and turned to leave, but one of the men stepped in front of me. He was taller than the others, with a shaved head and a thick scar running down his cheek. He didn't say anything, just stared at me. "I need to get going," I said, trying to sound calm. He didn't move. The guy who had met me at the dock walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. "We need you to wait a minute," he said. I told them I couldn't stay, that I had to finish my shift, but they didn't care. The man with the scar grabbed my arm and led me toward the back of the warehouse. I tried to pull away, but his grip was like a vice. "Just a minute," he said. "We need to check something." I didn't know what they meant, but the way they were acting made my stomach twist. They led me to a small office at the back of the building. The windows were covered with blinds, and the only light came from a flickering fluorescent bulb. "Sit," the guy with the scar said, pointing to a metal chair in the middle of the room. I sat. My hands were sweating, and my heart was racing. They stood around me, blocking the door. The guy who had handed me the clipboard opened the crate. I couldn't see what was inside from where I was sitting, but the others leaned in, murmuring to each other. "What's going on?" I asked. They didn't answer. One of them, a younger guy with a nervous look on his face, glanced at me and then quickly looked away. The man with the scar closed the crate and walked over to me. "Where did you pick this up?" he asked. I told him the address. He nodded but didn't say anything else. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the light above us. Then he leaned down, his face inches from mine. "Did you open it?" I shook my head. "No. I just picked it up like I was told." He stared at me for a long moment, then straightened up. "Good. Stay here." The four of them left the room, locking the door behind them. I stood up and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on the door, yelling for them to let me out, but no one came. I didn't know how long I was in there, but it felt like hours. I could hear faint voices outside, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then I heard something else, something heavy being dragged across the floor. I looked around the room, trying to find something to defend myself with, but there was nothing. Just the chair, the desk, and a filing cabinet. I opened the drawers, but they were empty. The door finally opened, and the guy with the scar came back in. He had something in his hand, a long, thin knife. My throat went dry. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "I was just doing my job," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped closer, holding the knife at his side. Sometimes people see things they shouldn't. Hear things they shouldn't. I backed up until I hit the wall. I didn't see anything. I swear. He tilted his head, like he was considering my words. Then he smiled, a cold, humorless smile that made my skin crawl. "You're going to help us clean up," he said. I didn't understand what he meant until he grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the room. The other three men were standing by the crate, which was now lying on its side. Something was sticking out of it, a piece of fabric, dark and stained. "Get rid of it," the man with the scar said to the others. One of them hesitated. "What about him?" he asked, nodding toward me. The scarred man looked at me, his expression unreadable. "He's going to help." They handed me a tarp and a roll of duct tape. I didn't want to take them, but I didn't have a choice. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto them. They opened the crate fully, and I saw what was inside. I won't describe it. I can't. All I'll say is that it was worse than anything I'd ever imagined. "We don't have all night," one of them snapped. I don't know how I got through it. I just did what they told me, trying not to think about what I was doing, about what I'd seen. When we were done, they loaded everything into a truck parked behind the warehouse. "Now leave," the man with the scar said, shoving me toward the door. I didn't wait. I ran to my truck and drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. I didn't go to the police. I didn't tell anyone. I just quit my job and tried to forget. But I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see that crate. And I know they're still out there. I still can't shake off what happened that weekend. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, just a couple of days in the woods with a few friends, nothing special. A chance to get away from the hustle, enjoy some fresh air, and have a break from the usual grind. I'd been hiking a few times before, so I knew what to expect. But that weekend, it turned into something completely different. We drove up on Friday afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. There were 5 of us, me, my brother James, his girlfriend Sarah, and two of our friends, Dan and Laura. We found a spot deep in the woods, far enough away from any major trails. It was quiet, peaceful, just how we wanted it. We set up camp, built a fire, and spent the evening talking, laughing, and drinking beers. We didn't think about much, just enjoying the moment. Saturday was pretty uneventful. We hiked, explored a bit, and spent the day relaxing by the river. We had a good dinner, played some card games, and then went to bed early because we were all exhausted from the hike. The night was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence you can only get when you're far away from city noise. We fell asleep with no problems at all. But when we woke up on Sunday morning, everything felt off. The weather was fine, but there was something in the air that made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it. The others didn't seem to notice, though. We packed up our things, folded the tents, and were about ready to head back to the car. That's when things started to go wrong. We had parked the car just off the main road, about a quarter of a mile from our campsite. It was tucked into a small clearing, hidden enough that we didn't worry about it being visible from the main trail. We all made our way back down the path, talking and laughing, until we came to the clearing. That's when we saw it. The car looked fine from a distance, but as we got closer, I noticed something. The tires. Every single one of them was slashed. Flat as a pancake. And as I walked around the back, I saw the engine hood was open. My heart started to race. I looked at James, who looked just as confused as I felt. "Who the hell would do this?" he muttered, walking toward the hood. I didn't know what to say. It was just wrong. Why would anyone be out here? The place we were camping wasn't exactly easy to get to. It wasn't like someone could just casually wander by. We hadn't seen anyone else on the trails the whole time we were there. It didn't make any sense. James looked under the hood, poking around. "It's tampered with. Someone's been messing with the engine. There's no way this happened overnight." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "What do you think happened?" "I don't know," he said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. "But it's not good. I think we're stuck here." "Stuck?" Dan said, his voice rising. "You're telling me we're stuck out here? How? We're miles from the nearest town. We can't just walk back." We all stood there, staring at the car in disbelief. I could see the panic creeping into everyone's faces. It was supposed to be a simple trip. We were supposed to drive back and enjoy the rest of the day. But now, we were stranded. And someone had clearly done this on purpose. "We need to call for help," I said, trying to keep calm, even though I could feel my own nerves starting to fray. "Maybe someone can come get us." "Good luck with that," Laura said, holding up her phone. "There's no signal out here. Remember?" She was right. We hadn't had any reception since we started the hike, and now there was no way to contact anyone. It was just the five of us, stuck in the middle of nowhere. I paced around the car, trying to think. There had to be something we could do. But when I looked at the damage again, it became clear someone had deliberately destroyed the car. The tires were slashed clean through. The engine was messed with in a way that made it obvious it wasn't some random vandal. This was intentional. Someone wanted us stuck here. I felt the air grow heavier, like the forest around us was closing in. The peaceful getaway had turned into something darker. I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility of whoever had done this still being nearby. Watching us. Waiting. "We need to figure out what to do," James said. "We can't just sit here." "We could try to hike out," I suggested. "It's not far to the road. Maybe we can flag someone down, get a tow truck or something." But no one seemed too keen on that idea. It was starting to get late in the afternoon, and we were already exhausted from the hike the day before. None of us were in any condition to walk the distance, especially with the heavy feeling hanging over us. No one said it, but we all knew it. It wasn't just the car that was messed up. Something was wrong here. Someone had gone out of their way to trap us. We sat around the car for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. It felt like every second that passed, the weight of the situation just kept getting heavier. The trees around us, once just part of a nice forest, now seemed to press in closer. The whole world felt quieter, like we were being watched, even though we didn't see anything out of place. Then, just as we were starting to talk about maybe going on foot, we heard something. A noise. A branch snapping in the woods. We all froze. Everyone turned to look, their eyes wide with the same realization. We weren't alone. For what felt like forever, we stood there, barely breathing, listening. But the noise didn't come again. It could have been an animal, just the wind, or maybe a trick of the mind. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that we had no way out. No way to know who or what had done this to us. We made a decision then, even though it felt impossible. We would try to walk out. Stick together. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves felt like someone was getting closer. It wasn't an easy hike out. It was a long, exhausting trek, made worse by the growing sense of fear that hung over us. But we finally made it to a place where we could get a signal on our phones, and after what felt like hours, we managed to get through to someone who could help. They showed up and towed us back to town. We didn't look back at the woods as we drove away. None of us said much during the ride. We were all just too shaken. To this day, I still don't know who did it or why. But I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched the whole time. We got out safe, yes. But something about that weekend, it wasn't just the car. It was the feeling that we were never meant to leave. It started as just another drive home from work. The kind of uneventful commute you don't even think about. I was merging onto the highway when a black SUV cut me off. I hit the brakes hard, my seatbelt digging into my chest, and I leaned on the horn without even thinking about it. I wasn't angry, really, just startled. The driver threw up a hand, like they were waving me off, and I thought that was the end of it. A couple of miles later, I noticed the SUV again. They were hanging in my blind spot, then speeding up to stay even with me. I glanced over, trying to get a look at them, but the windows were tinted too dark to see anything. I didn't think much of it until they swerved closer, like they were trying to nudge into my lane. I moved over into the right lane just to get away from them, but they followed, sticking right behind me this time. At that point, I started to feel uneasy. I checked the time, 6:30 p.m., and figured maybe they were just in a hurry to get somewhere, but my stomach was tight. I decided to ignore them and keep driving. If they were trying to mess with me, I didn't want to give them the satisfaction. But then they started following me off the highway. My exit wasn't busy, just a small turnoff that led into a residential area. I didn't think it was strange until I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them right there, just a car length behind me. There were no other cars around, no reason for them to be on my tail like that. I made a left at the light, and so did they. I made a right at the next street, and they stayed with me. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe they lived in the same direction. But then I took another left, this time into a random neighborhood I didn't even know, and they followed. I drove in circles for a while, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. But no matter how many turns I made, they were there, close enough for me to see their headlights in my mirror. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, so did they. I decided to test it. At the next intersection, I pulled into a gas station and parked right in front of the convenience store, where it was bright and busy. The SUV passed by without stopping, and I let out a shaky breath, laughing at myself for getting so worked up. But then, not even 2 minutes later, they circled back and pulled into the lot, parking just a few spaces away. I couldn't see who was inside. the windows were still too dark. I stared at the car, trying to figure out what to do. My phone was in my lap, and I thought about calling someone, but I didn't even know what to say. "Hey, I think someone's following me," sounded ridiculous. Instead, I got out and went into the store, my keys clutched tight in my hand. I lingered by the counter, pretending to browse the candy display while I kept an eye on the door. The SUV stayed parked outside. Nobody got out. When I finally worked up the nerve to leave, I took a long route back to my car, walking through the rows of pumps to avoid getting too close to the SUV. I climbed in and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I decided to head toward the main road, where it was busier. If they followed me again, at least there'd be witnesses. Sure enough, as soon as I pulled out, the SUV did too. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I merged into traffic, trying to act like I didn't notice them. That's when they started speeding up. I was doing 40 in a 35, and they were getting closer, their headlights bright in my rearview mirror. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but they matched my speed, staying just a few feet behind me. I switched lanes, hoping they'd pass, but instead, they swerved into the same lane and honked. It felt like my chest was caving in. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what I'd done to make them so angry. Was it the horn? Was it because I cut them off earlier? I couldn't remember doing anything wrong. I spotted a police station up ahead and turned into the parking lot without thinking. The SUV slowed down but didn't follow me in. They rolled past, and I caught a glimpse of the driver's silhouette, a large figure, maybe a man, but I couldn't be sure. I stayed in the lot for a while, waiting for my nerves to settle. When I finally felt calm enough to leave, I didn't see the SUV anywhere. I decided to take a longer route home, just to be safe. I stuck to busy streets and well-lit areas, glancing in my mirrors every few seconds. I thought I'd lost them. I really did. But when I turned onto my street, there they were, parked a few houses down from mine. My stomach dropped. I drove past my house, not wanting them to know where I lived. Instead, I went around the block and parked in someone else's driveway, crouching low in my seat. The SUV idled for a minute before pulling away. I waited until I couldn't see their taillights anymore, then backed out and drove straight to a friend's house. I didn't go home that night. I didn't even tell my friend what happened. I just made up some excuse about needing company and stayed on their couch, staring at the ceiling until morning. The next day, I filed a report with the police. They took my statement but said there wasn't much they could do without a license plate or a clearer description of the driver. I started noticing SUVs everywhere after that, at intersections, in parking lots, parked along my route to work. Each time, my stomach would clench, and I'd have to remind myself that it probably wasn't them. I never saw the black SUV again after that, but I still think about it every time I get in my car. Every time I glance in the mirror and see headlights too close behind me. I still wonder who they were, what they wanted, and why they stopped following me when they did. I don't know if I'll ever get those answers. It happened a few weeks ago, and I still can't stop thinking about it. It started off as an ordinary drive, just me on a quiet road, the kind that goes on forever with hardly any traffic. I'd been out for a few hours, taking the back roads through the countryside. My goal was just to clear my head, enjoy some solitude. The sun had started to set, casting everything in a dim golden light, and the road was empty. It was peaceful. But then I saw him. He was standing at the side of the road, waving his arms like he was trying to flag me down. At first, I thought it was a person in trouble. Maybe their car had broken down or they needed directions. I was alone, and it was the kind of road where help could be a long time coming, so I thought I'd stop and see if he was okay. It wasn't until I was closer that I started to get a bad feeling. There was something off about the way he was standing, how rigid he seemed, like he was almost too still for someone who was supposedly in need. I slowed the car, my instincts telling me to at least be cautious. As I got closer, the man didn't step forward, just stood there with his arms out, still waving, his face impossible to read. I could see his eyes now. Something about them, it wasn't panic or desperation, but more like calculation. The pit of my stomach tightened, but I told myself not to overthink it. I wasn't a kid anymore, and it was probably fine. I stopped a few feet from him, rolled down the window, and asked, "Hey, you need some help?" He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, then back at me, and finally nodded. "Yeah," he said, voice a little rough. "I've been walking for miles. My truck broke down back there. I don't know what happened to it. Can you give me a lift to the gas station, just a few miles up the road?" Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. I could see that his clothes were dirty, but there wasn't any sign of a breakdown, no car nearby, no tools. Just this guy, standing on the side of the road, looking like he'd been out there for hours. I wanted to drive off, but I didn't want to seem rude. "Are you sure it's not far?" I asked, my eyes scanning the trees along the road behind him. "Yeah," he said quickly, shaking his head. "It's just up there. It's not far, I swear." I hesitated for a second longer, and that's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. From behind the trees, figures started to emerge. At first, I thought maybe they were other travelers, but then I saw the way they moved, purposeful, deliberate. It wasn't the casual walk of someone on a hike. It was controlled. That's when everything hit me. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. These weren't just random people. I don't know how I knew, but I could tell. I quickly rolled the window up halfway, keeping my hand on the door handle, just in case. The first figure that came out was a man, tall and broad, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Behind him, two more people, a woman and another man. They all looked off. Their clothes were mismatched, like they had been wearing whatever they could find. They weren't acting normal either. Their eyes were fixed on me, and they were moving with intent. The man who'd been standing by the road had stopped waving and was just staring at me now, a strange half-smile forming on his lips. I could feel my heart racing as my mind went into overdrive, calculating escape routes. I glanced behind me, trying to figure out if I could make a fast getaway. The road stretched out for miles, and I had no idea what was out there. I tried to force myself to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. The man who'd been flagging me down took a step closer, his hand resting on the side of my car. "You know," he said, his tone changing, becoming smoother, more menacing, "we don't take kindly to people who don't help each other out around here." My throat tightened. I wasn't stupid. I knew I had to get out of there, fast. But just as I was about to shift into drive, the man placed his hand on my side mirror and leaned down. "It'd be better if you just got out of the car," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No reason to make this hard." The others had closed the distance now. The woman was smiling, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The two men were standing off to the side, each of them looking ready to move at any moment. I froze, not knowing what to do, but my instincts kicked in. I slammed my foot on the gas, spinning the wheels on the gravel before I sped off, throwing up a cloud of dust in my rearview mirror. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked back once, seeing them all standing there in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. It was only when I rounded a corner and they disappeared from view that I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands still gripping the steering wheel as if I were holding on to my life itself. I didn't see them again, but I kept checking my mirrors the entire way, convinced they were somehow following me. I made it to the next town and found a small diner to stop at, where I called the police and explained everything. I wasn't sure if they would take me seriously, but they said they'd look into it. They told me to be cautious, but the road was too quiet and remote for them to have much information. I don't know who they were, but I'm glad I drove away. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed. I haven't gone back on that road since, and I don't think I ever will. Something about those people, I just knew they weren't out there for a friendly chat. And I still wonder if I was the only one they'd ever tried it with. The train was almost empty, as it always was this late at night. I had taken this route countless times before, and it usually felt safe enough. Most of the people on the train were either glued to their phones or half asleep, just trying to get home like me. That night, though, something was different. I noticed him about 2 stops after I got on. He was sitting a few rows down, angled just enough that I could see his face clearly. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but every time I glanced in his direction, his eyes were locked on me. He wasn't even pretending to look away. It wasn't like he was staring off into space. It was deliberate. Focused. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was zoning out, or maybe he just had one of those faces that looked intense. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling, hoping to distract myself, but I could still feel his eyes on me. It was like a weight pressing on the back of my neck. A few minutes passed, and I risked another glance. He was still staring, his expression unreadable. He didn't look angry or friendly, just focused. It wasn't casual, though. It wasn't normal. I decided to move. There was no reason to sit there feeling uncomfortable when the car behind me was empty. At the next stop, I stood up and walked quickly to the next set of doors. As I stepped into the other car, I glanced back. He was still sitting there, his eyes following me the entire time. The new car was almost completely empty, just a young couple near the back who looked like they were coming back from a night out. I sat down closer to the front, near the door, and tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe he wasn't following me. Maybe it was all in my head. A minute later, I heard the door behind me slide open. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I could feel it, the way the air seemed to shift, the way my skin prickled. He had followed me. He sat down in the same row as me, just on the opposite side of the aisle. Close enough that I could see him in my peripheral vision, but not close enough that it felt like an immediate threat. Still, it was deliberate. It had to be. My heart was pounding now. I stared out the window, pretending to be engrossed in the darkness rushing past, but all I could think about was him. Why was he following me? What did he want? At the next stop, I stood up again. I didn't look at him. I didn't want to give him any excuse to interact with me. I walked calmly to the door, stepped out onto the platform, and crossed to the next car. The train was still stopped, the doors still open. I glanced back, hoping, praying that he would stay where he was. He didn't. I saw him step off the train just as the doors were starting to close. For a second, I thought maybe he was leaving, but then he darted toward the door of the car I had just entered. He made it through just before it shut. I felt trapped. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. There weren't many people around. Just a handful of passengers scattered throughout the car. None of them seemed to notice what was happening. Or if they did, they didn't care. I sat down near the door, clutching my bag tightly. He didn't sit this time. He stood, leaning against the pole in the middle of the car, staring at me like it was the most natural thing in the world. His eyes were dark, unblinking. I couldn't stay on the train with him. I had to get off. But if I got off, would he follow me again? What if no one else got off at the same stop? What if it was just the two of us? The next stop was coming up. I stood up before the train even began to slow, hoping to make it look like I had been planning to get off all along. When the doors opened, I stepped out quickly, walking briskly toward the escalators without looking back. I could hear footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate. He wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. The platform was nearly empty. I saw a man in a reflective vest, a worker, probably, and I headed straight for him. I didn't care if I looked paranoid. I just needed to get away from this guy. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "Can you tell me where the nearest exit is?" The worker looked up from whatever he was doing and gave me a quick nod. "Just up the escalator, to your right." I glanced back, and the man who had been following me had stopped a few feet away, standing still in the middle of the platform. He wasn't looking at the worker. He was looking at me. His expression hadn't changed. I thanked the worker and hurried to the escalator. My heart was racing so hard I thought I might pass out. I didn't look back again until I was outside, standing in the cold air under the harsh glow of a streetlight. He wasn't there. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath. The streets were quiet, but there were a few people around, enough to make me feel somewhat safe. I called a rideshare and stayed under the streetlight until it arrived, keeping my eyes on the station entrance the entire time. The man never came out. I don't know if he stayed on the platform or got back on the train, but I didn't see him again. I've taken that route since then, but only during the day. And I don't sit near the doors anymore. I don't let my guard down. Not after that. It started like any other night. My friends and I had gone to a party at a house just off campus. It was the usual thing: loud music, red cups, and people laughing a little too loudly. Nothing out of the ordinary. I'd been to 100 parties like this before. You show up, you talk to people, maybe you drink a little, then you go home. Simple. That's how I met him, Ethan. He was standing by the kitchen counter when I walked in, talking to a couple of people I didn't know. I wasn't really looking to meet anyone, but he smiled and waved me over. I figured, why not? Maybe I'd find someone to talk to, maybe even make a new friend. I was new to the area, and most of my time was spent either in class or studying, so getting out was a nice change. Ethan was charming. Not in the way that made you feel like he was trying too hard, but just enough to make you feel comfortable. He had a friendly smile, a laid-back vibe, and we had some mutual friends. We started talking, and the conversation just flowed. He wasn't pushy or intense, but there was something about him that kept pulling me in. He asked where I was from, what I was studying, and we chatted about campus life. At first, everything felt completely normal. He made me laugh, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. But as the night went on, I started noticing something. It wasn't anything huge, just little things that felt off. Every time I tried to walk away to talk to someone else, he'd follow me, like he didn't want to be separated. He would keep reappearing in the same places, even when I hadn't seen him for a while. After a few hours, I was ready to leave. I didn't know anyone very well at the party, and I wasn't in the mood to stay up late. I said goodbye to my friends and started heading for the door. But as I walked past the kitchen, there was Ethan again. He must have noticed I was leaving, because he immediately started walking toward me. "Hey, don't leave yet," he said, his voice a little too eager. I paused, feeling a little awkward. "I think I'm done for the night." "It's been fun, though." He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that made me hesitate. "I get it, but we should hang out sometime. Maybe grab a coffee? What's your number?" At that point, I was starting to feel uncomfortable. He seemed nice, but there was something about the way he kept asking that felt a little too intense. Still, I didn't want to be rude, so I gave him my number. It wasn't a big deal at first. He texted me the next day, saying he had a good time at the party and asking if I wanted to meet up for coffee sometime. I didn't think much of it. I responded, and we set a time. I went to the coffee shop, thinking it would just be a casual hangout. When I showed up, he was already there. We had a good time, at least, at first. He was easy to talk to, and I thought maybe I'd been reading too much into things. Maybe he was just a little clingy. We talked about our classes, campus events, and the usual small talk. But as the conversation went on, he started asking questions that felt a little too personal. "So, what are you doing later? Are you living in the dorms? Is it just you there?" I tried to brush it off, telling him I didn't have any big plans, just homework. But he kept pushing, asking about my roommates, about my schedule, and how often I was out. It started to feel invasive. I politely told him I had to go, and as I was leaving, he walked me to the door. "Hey, I'll walk you back to your dorm. It's not safe for a girl to be out here alone." I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't want to make him feel bad, but I also didn't want him to think I needed him to walk me back. So I told him I'd be fine and gave a half-hearted excuse about being in a rush. He smiled but didn't push it, which was a small relief. Over the next few weeks, things got weirder. Ethan started showing up outside my classes. I'd be walking to a lecture, and there he'd be, just standing there, waiting. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. But when I saw him the third time, I started to feel uneasy. He'd wave, walk up, and ask if I was heading to lunch or if I had time to grab a coffee. It wasn't just in the classroom building. He'd pop up outside the library or near the student center. Once, I had just finished a study session, and when I walked out, I saw him standing by a bench, looking around like he was waiting for someone. I was about to turn the other way when he spotted me and waved me over. At first, I thought maybe he just enjoyed talking to me, but I started to get this strange feeling. It wasn't just his constant appearances, it was how he acted when he saw me. He'd act like we were the best of friends, but it felt forced. Like he was trying too hard to convince me we were close. One evening, I came back to my dorm after a long day of classes, and when I opened the door to my room, I froze. I could have sworn I saw someone's shadow move past the window. I stepped back quickly and looked around. My heart started pounding. I hadn't seen Ethan in a few days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was him. I checked the peephole on the door, but it was empty. Still, I couldn't relax. I didn't want to assume the worst, but my gut was telling me something wasn't right. I didn't see him again for a few days after that, but when I did, he was waiting outside my dorm building. I couldn't help but feel like he was watching me. It didn't take long for my friends to notice either. I'd mentioned the weird occurrences, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. They assured me it was probably nothing, but the more time passed, the more convinced I was that something was off. I started avoiding the places I knew Ethan might show up. I changed the times I'd leave for class, took a longer route when I went to the library, and even started taking the bus instead of walking. But then, one day, when I was on my way back from the grocery store, I turned the corner to see Ethan standing across the street from my dorm. He was just standing there, staring. My heart dropped into my stomach. I quickly ducked behind a nearby car, hoping he hadn't seen me, but when I looked up again, he was gone. The next day, I didn't go to class. I called my mom and told her everything that had been happening. She was concerned, of course. She urged me to report him, but I was hesitant. What if I was overreacting? What if he was just being friendly? That evening, I got a text from Ethan, the first in a few days. It was short, but it made my skin crawl. I see you're avoiding me. I'll be outside your dorm at 8. We need to talk. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked his number and made a plan to speak with campus security the next day. I never saw him again, at least not in the same way. I've always considered myself a fairly aware person, someone who trusts their instincts when something feels off. But that doesn't mean I'm always right. And it certainly didn't help me the day I encountered the man at my front door. It started as an ordinary Thursday. I was working from home that day, sitting at my desk with my headphones in, trying to power through a stack of emails. The neighborhood was quiet, as it usually is in the middle of the day. There weren't many cars driving by, and most people were at work. I didn't expect any interruptions, but of course, life rarely goes as planned. I was just about to open my email inbox when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated. I checked the time. It was just past noon, and no one usually stopped by unannounced. Still, I figured it was maybe a delivery, or perhaps someone from the neighborhood with a question. I got up and peeked through the peephole. There was a man standing on my porch, holding a clipboard. He was dressed in dark blue work clothes that looked official, with a utility company's logo on the sleeve. At least, that's what I thought I saw from the peephole. I opened the door slightly, keeping the chain lock on. "Hello?" I asked, not fully opening it. "Good afternoon," the man said in a calm, neutral voice. "I'm from the gas company. We're conducting some routine safety checks in the area, and there's been a report of a gas leak nearby. Just want to make sure everything's good on your end. Mind if I come in for a few minutes to check your system?" His demeanor seemed normal enough, nothing overtly suspicious. In fact, he even looked polite, like someone doing his job. I briefly wondered if maybe it was just some routine maintenance or if they were trying to get everyone's systems up to code. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I don't know if it was the way he looked at me, or how quickly he rattled off his explanation. But my gut told me to be cautious. However, I told myself I was overthinking it. I had utility workers in my house before, and they all had done their jobs without issue. So, against my better judgment, I nodded. "Sure, okay," I said, opening the door wider. "Just give me a second." I went to take the chain lock off, but before I could, he pushed the door open slightly more, just enough to slip inside. He didn't rush in, but he didn't wait for an invitation either. "Thanks," he said, as though he'd been invited in already. His voice had shifted slightly, and it made me tense up. I couldn't explain it. Something wasn't right. I'll just need a minute," I said, trying to keep my composure. "I just need to grab my phone, and I'll be right with you." I was hoping to buy some time. Maybe I could call the utility company to double check, but as I turned to walk into the living room, I heard the sound of the door clicking shut behind me. My heart skipped. It wasn't the usual sound of the door closing, it was unmistakably the sound of the door locking. I spun around quickly, already feeling a cold rush of panic. The man was standing there, looking calm, almost too calm. Is everything all right? You seem a little tense. My blood turned cold. What do you mean, the door is locked? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Just a precaution, he said with a half smile, though there was no real warmth behind it. You wouldn't want any issues with your gas, would you? He took a step further into the house without waiting for an answer. I wasn't sure what to do, but my instinct screamed at me to get out, to get away from him, to run. I knew the door was locked behind me, and I had no idea if he had locked it himself or if he had some key. Can you please unlock the door? I asked, trying to stay calm. He ignored me, continuing to step further inside like he was familiar with the house. Just wanted to check a few things. He moved past me, into the kitchen. I could feel the air in the room shift, the tension building in my chest. I told myself I was overreacting, but my gut was telling me something else entirely. He opened the kitchen cabinets and began to inspect them, as if it was part of his job. It was too odd. The gas lines were outside, right? Why would he need to look around the house? I stared at him, trying to come up with a plan. Was this guy really a worker, or was something far worse happening? I needed to do something, anything, to get control of the situation. But what? I didn't want to confront him directly, not when I had no idea what he could do. I could tell he wasn't acting normal anymore. His actions were deliberate and methodical. He wasn't here to check the gas. He was here for something else. I took a step toward the door, my hand brushing against the wall as I prepared to make a break for it. But before I could move, he turned to face me. I should probably check upstairs, he said, with that same unsettling calm. You wouldn't want any surprises, right? I froze. My pulse quickened. My mind was racing. I had to stop him from going upstairs. He couldn't get to the second floor, where my bedroom was, where I kept my phone. No, I said, a little too firmly. No, there's no need to go upstairs. I have a gas detector in the basement. It's just down there. It's fine. He looked at me for a second, then smiled again, but this time it wasn't friendly at all. If you say so, he said, his voice dropping lower. I'll just have a quick look upstairs. You know, for safety. I was done. This wasn't happening. I made a quick decision. Without saying another word, I turned and bolted for the front door. I had to get out. I had to get away from this man. As I reached the door, I fumbled with the lock, trying to turn it. I heard him behind me, his footsteps quickening, but I didn't dare turn around. The door finally opened, and I stumbled out onto the porch, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's house, pounding on their door with everything I had. They let me in, and I quickly explained what had happened. My neighbor, thankfully, called the police immediately. The man never came back, and the police couldn't find any sign of him when they checked the area, but they assured me that he wasn't a utility worker. He didn't have any identification. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I learned my lesson that day. You don't just trust anyone who knocks at your door, no matter what they claim. And you definitely don't let them inside. I've taken extra precautions since then. Deadbolts, security cameras, and a new routine. I can't risk that feeling again. I just wish I knew what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. It started as a normal Thursday. The kind of day you don't expect anything unusual to happen, so you go about your business without thinking twice. I had just finished lunch, and I was scrolling through some emails when I heard a knock at the door. It was strange because I wasn't expecting anything, and no one ever visits me during the middle of the day. But I figured it was just another package. I'd been ordering a lot of things lately. When I opened the door, there was no one there, but a large, nondescript cardboard box was sitting on the step. It wasn't even taped shut properly, just sort of hastily sealed with a few strips of packing tape. There was no return address, just a shipping label with my name and address typed in black ink. I figured it was an error, maybe a delivery mix-up. After all, I had made some online purchases recently, so it didn't seem out of place to get an unexpected package. I brought it inside, curiosity getting the better of me. At first, I thought I'd just call the delivery service and have them pick it up, but then I realized I'd better check it myself to avoid making a bigger fuss. As I peeled away the tape, I noticed the box felt unusually heavy for its size. I opened the flaps, and at first, all I saw were layers of bubble wrap and packing peanuts. But as I dug deeper, I froze. Inside the box were several neatly packaged plastic bags, each filled with something I couldn't immediately identify. The first bag contained small vials, some of which looked like they could hold a liquid, others like powder. The second contained what appeared to be stacks of cash, bound tightly with rubber bands. And the third, that was when I realized something was seriously wrong. It was a small, sealed box, labeled in a foreign language, with an ominous, almost clinical-looking symbol on it. I had no idea what any of it was, but my mind immediately began racing, trying to make sense of it. I knew right away that these were not things I should have had in my possession. I was in a complete panic at this point. I thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. What if it was just a mistake? What if it was meant for someone else and I got tangled in something I didn't even understand? I knew I couldn't just throw the package away or ignore it. This wasn't something you could easily explain away, and the weight of it all began to settle in. I paced around my apartment, trying to calm myself down. The more I thought about it, the worse it seemed. I looked out the window and realized something else. There was a car parked across the street. It had been there for a while, and I don't remember seeing it when I left for lunch. At first, I told myself it was probably just a neighbor's car, but then I noticed something strange. The person sitting inside wasn't moving. I stared at the car for a long time, trying to make out any details through the blinds. There was a man inside, but he wasn't looking at anything. He was just sitting there, still, like he was waiting. It made my skin crawl. I'd never seen him before, and I didn't recognize the car either. Could this be a coincidence? I went back to the package, still unsure what to do. I carefully closed it up, trying not to disturb anything too much. My mind raced with the possibilities. If this was a mistake, why wasn't anyone trying to retrieve it? The more I thought about it, the more I started to suspect this wasn't an error at all. Someone had deliberately sent this package to my home. I pulled my phone out and checked the delivery tracking. Nothing. The status said it was delivered, but there was no sign of a shipment order from my account. It didn't add up. I tried calling the courier service, but they were closed for the day. That left me with no answers. The car across the street was still there, parked in the same spot, with the man still sitting inside, doing nothing. At this point, I felt completely exposed. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I decided to take a chance and called a friend. I told him about the package, about the man in the car, and how everything felt off. He didn't have much advice, but he did tell me to stay inside and keep the doors locked. As I was talking to him, I saw something else, a shadow darting quickly past the window. I froze. Someone was walking across the yard toward my front door. It wasn't the man in the car. This was someone else. I hung up the phone and moved quietly to the window, peeking through the blinds just enough to see outside. The person walking toward my house didn't seem to notice I was watching. I couldn't make out any details, but their gait was hurried. My breath caught in my throat when they reached the porch. They stopped right at the door, almost like they knew exactly where they were going. I didn't know what to do. The last thing I wanted to do was open the door and face whatever was happening. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I slowly backed away from the window. My mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. The strange package, the man in the car, and now this person at my door. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things, but it felt like I was being watched. Like the whole situation was a setup. I locked all the windows and doors, double-checked everything, and grabbed my phone, ready to call the police if necessary. I looked out the window again, and the man in the car was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The person who had been walking across the yard, they were gone too, just vanished into thin air. Had they come for the package? Were they watching to make sure I didn't call the authorities? I had no idea, but I knew that whatever was going on, it wasn't normal. The next few hours felt like an eternity. I kept my phone close and stayed away from the windows, too scared to check if anyone was outside. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, wondering if someone would come back for the package. The next morning, I contacted the police, and they came by to take the package for evidence. They didn't give me many details, but assured me they would look into it. They seemed to believe it was a mix-up, though the fact that it had no tracking or return address made them suspicious. It's been weeks since then, and I still don't feel safe. I moved my furniture around, changed my daily routine, and made sure I'm always paying attention to what's going on outside. I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching me, waiting for me to slip up. And every time I hear a knock at the door, or see a car stop across the street, I get that same sinking feeling in my stomach. I've never felt more paranoid in my life. The whole thing doesn't add up, and I'm starting to think the package wasn't a mistake after all. Whoever sent it, whoever's been watching, they haven't left. And I don't know when they'll be back. It was supposed to be a fun road trip. My wife, Rachel, and I had been planning this for months. We were taking the kids Olivia, who's 9, and Ethan, who's 12, on a week-long trip across the state. The plan was simple: drive through a few small towns, hit some parks, and just enjoy the time away. Everything was going smoothly until it wasn't. We were about 4 hours into the trip when Rachel, who was driving, suggested we take a scenic route off the highway. The GPS was showing a back road that cut through some woods and farmland. I thought it sounded nice. It'd give us a break from the monotonous highway and might make for some good photos. Besides, we had plenty of time. We took the turn and started down the narrow road. It felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. There were no other cars, no houses, just endless stretches of trees. As we drove on, I started to feel uneasy. There was something off about the place, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The trees grew thick on either side of the road, and there was a stillness in the air, like the whole world was holding its breath. It didn't help that the sun was starting to set. The road twisted and turned, getting narrower the farther we went. My daughter Olivia started to complain that it was getting dark, and even Ethan seemed to be getting restless in the back seat. I figured it would just be a few more miles, so I told Rachel to keep going, but my gut told me something wasn't right. There was a nagging feeling that maybe we had gone too far. "Hey, do you think we should turn back?" I asked Rachel, trying to sound casual. "I think we're fine," she said, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice. "We'll just check the map again. I'll find us a spot to turn around soon." That's when we saw it. A small town. It wasn't on the GPS, and I didn't remember passing any signs. But there it was, right at the end of the road. A place that looked like it belonged in the past. The buildings were old, rundown, some with broken windows and boarded up doors. The streetlights flickered as we drove through the empty main street. There wasn't a soul in sight. Rachel slowed the car to a crawl. I noticed an old gas station on the corner, the kind you see in movies, and a diner with its lights still on. But there was no one around. No cars. No people. Just the eerie quiet. This doesn't feel right, I said, more to myself than to Rachel. Maybe we should ask someone for directions, Rachel suggested. She sounded just as uncomfortable as I felt. We pulled into the gas station. The place was small, dusty, and the pumps looked ancient. I got out and walked over to the attendant, a middle-aged man who was sitting behind the counter, staring at a small TV. He didn't even look up as I approached. "Hey, we're a little lost." We took a wrong turn, and we were wondering how to get back to the main road. The man slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine. His face was expressionless, and his eyes were dull, almost lifeless. "You shouldn't be here," he said flatly. I laughed nervously. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that." "You shouldn't be here," he repeated, his voice low, almost threatening. I glanced back at the car, where Rachel and the kids were waiting. "We're just passing through," I said, trying to keep the situation light. "Don't stay long," the man said. He finally stood up, walking slowly towards the back of the station without another word. I watched him disappear into the shadows of the building. I was starting to get a bad feeling about this place. Something about the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, it wasn't right. I went back to the car quickly. "Rachel, we need to go. Now." Rachel frowned. "What happened?" "Just get us out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "This place is off." We didn't drive more than a couple hundred yards before we saw the first person. A man, standing on the side of the road. He was tall, thin, and wearing an old, tattered jacket. His face was pale, with hollow cheeks, and he was staring directly at us as we passed. I didn't make eye contact, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us. "That was weird," Rachel muttered under her breath. "What do you think that guy was about?" "I don't know, but I don't want to find out," I said, looking back at the man in the rearview mirror. "I think we should just turn around." We turned around, but by the time we reached the spot where we entered the town, there was another man standing in the road, blocking our path. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at us with a cold, calculating look. Rachel slammed on the brakes, and we came to a stop a few feet from him. The man didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at the car. "Get out of the way!" I shouted through the windshield, my pulse quickening. "We need to leave." The man didn't move. My heart was pounding now. I didn't know what these people were doing here, but they weren't making any effort to help us. They were just watching us like we were prey. Rachel backed the car up, turning in the opposite direction, but before we could go far, another man appeared, this one much closer. He was leaning against a lamppost, casually smoking a cigarette. "Do you have a problem?" I yelled at him, my voice shaking. "We don't want any trouble. We just need to leave." The man took a long drag of his cigarette and threw it on the ground. He slowly straightened up and took a step toward the car. "You're not going anywhere," he said quietly, but there was something in his tone that made it clear this was not a conversation. "Rachel, go! Now!" I shouted. Rachel hit the gas pedal, and we sped away, tires screeching as we turned down the narrow road. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the men following us. We didn't stop until we were back on the main highway, far away from that strange town. My hands were shaking, my heart still racing. The rest of the trip was quiet. Too quiet. We never talked about what happened. But we all knew. We were lucky to get out of there in one piece. And I swear, to this day, I can still see those faces in the rearview mirror, watching us as we drove away. We had been camping for 2 days when it all started. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just a group of friends looking to disconnect from our busy lives and spend some time in nature. No cell service, no distractions, just us in the woods. It was peaceful at first, just what we needed. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call or the rustling of the wind in the trees. We set up camp near a small creek, and everything was fine for the first day. We brought a portable radio with us to pass the time in the evenings. It was a cheap one, not anything fancy, just one of those small battery-operated models that could pick up the basic AM/FM stations. On the second night, after dinner and a few drinks, we sat around the fire and turned it on to see what we could pick up. There was nothing much on the regular stations, just static, so we started turning the dial randomly to see if we could find something more interesting. At first, it didn't seem like anything was out of the ordinary. We laughed, joked, and tried to make sense of the strange sounds we were hearing. The static would cut in and out, and we'd get fragments of voices now and then, but it was so garbled we could barely understand anything. We figured it was just bad reception, or maybe the batteries were starting to die. It wasn't until we started hearing clearer words that we began to get uneasy. It started with just a few short phrases. I remember one of the first ones, "They know where you are." It was barely audible at first, almost like a whisper lost in the static. At first, we thought it was just interference, something harmless. But the longer we listened, the more the voices began to come through. They were more distinct now, more deliberate. "Don't trust them. Stay inside tonight." It was the kind of thing that made you freeze for a moment. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to make of it. Was it a prank? Maybe some weird channel or station that was messing with us? But the voices, they didn't sound like radio hosts or anything normal. They sounded wrong. Like someone was trying to get a message through, but something was off. At first, we dismissed it. We laughed it off, tried to brush it away. We turned the dial again, and the voices stopped. We found another station, and the rest of the night went by quietly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing the words in my head, "Stay inside tonight." The next day, we went hiking during the day. It was a beautiful trail, and we enjoyed it, trying to forget about the strange occurrence from the night before. But when we got back to camp, the radio was still there, sitting on the log next to the fire pit. It was hard not to think about what happened, especially since the feeling in the air had changed. The wind had picked up, and the forest felt denser, like it was closing in on us. We didn't talk much about the radio. No one wanted to bring it up, but I think we were all thinking about it. It wasn't until nightfall that things really started to get strange. We sat down by the fire again, and one of us, Chris, I think, decided to mess with the radio again. This time, it wasn't just a few words. We picked up a full sentence, and it wasn't just static anymore. It was a voice, clear as day, like someone was right there with us. "Get out of the woods." We froze. It wasn't one of us, it wasn't a joke. It was a deep, raspy voice, almost threatening. The kind of voice that made your blood run cold. We all turned to look at each other, confused, but none of us said anything. Chris quickly turned the dial to another station, and for a few minutes, the radio was silent again. But it didn't stay that way. The static returned, but this time the words were louder, clearer, more urgent. They know you're here. They're watching. That's when it really hit me. My heart started to pound. This wasn't a coincidence. There was no way it could be. Someone was sending these messages. But who? And why? We tried turning the radio off, but as soon as we turned it back on, the same voice came through. Don't trust them. They're coming for you. At that point, I think we all realized something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just a weird coincidence anymore. I don't know what it was, but something was out there, and it knew we were here. The voices weren't random, they were directed at us. We didn't know what to do. We debated packing up and leaving, but it was getting late, and none of us wanted to make the hike back in the dark. We tried to stay calm, but every time we heard those messages, it felt like the forest was closing in on us. The firelight flickered, and the shadows around us seemed to grow longer, stretching toward us. The worst part was when the messages started to get more specific. You're not alone. Come out. We know you're hiding. That last one hit me the hardest. We weren't hiding. We were sitting there, by the fire, in plain sight. But the voice made it sound like we were being watched, like someone was waiting for us to make a move. I don't know how much time passed after that. We were all on edge, jumping at every sound, every movement in the trees. No one spoke for a long time. We just sat there, staring at the fire, listening to the radio crackling in the background. Then, around midnight, it happened. The message came through again, only this time it wasn't a warning. It was a command. Leave the camp. Now. I don't think any of us hesitated. We grabbed our things, packed up as quickly as we could, and started to head out. I don't know what we thought we were running from, but we couldn't stay there anymore. It felt like we were being hunted. We made it back to the parking lot and into our cars. No one said a word. We just got in, started the engines, and left. As we drove away, the radio continued to crackle behind us, but we didn't dare turn it back on. We never went back to that spot. We couldn't. The feeling of being watched, the messages, the way the forest felt like it was closing in on us, it was too much. To this day, I don't know who was sending those messages. I don't know what they wanted or why they were following us. But I do know that something was out there in those woods, something that wanted us to leave. And I'm not ever going back to find out who or what it was. It was one of those nights where the rain just wouldn't let up. I had been driving for hours, alone on a long stretch of road that had practically no streetlights. The kind of road where your headlights are the only thing guiding you. The rain was coming down in sheets, and I had to keep the wipers on full speed to even have a chance of seeing through the windshield. It was already late, and I was exhausted, just trying to get home. I don't know exactly what made me look up, but something caught my eye, a flash of something dark ahead. My heart dropped when I realized it was a truck, flipped over, blocking the road. I wasn't expecting to see that in the middle of nowhere. The truck had clearly been in a bad accident, and from what I could make out, it was badly damaged. I could barely see the outline of the vehicle through the rain, but the shape was unmistakable. I slowed down, pulling my car off to the side of the road. There was no other traffic, no sign of any other drivers. The road was empty, and the storm had swallowed up the world around me. My first instinct was to stop, check for survivors. If there was anyone left alive in that wreck, they'd need help. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, but I didn't have much of a signal. It was too spotty in that area. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. It was a wreck. I needed help, but I wasn't going to be able to do much alone. I got out of my car, feeling the cold rain soak through my jacket. The air smelled like wet asphalt and something else, something sour. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it made my stomach turn. As I got closer to the truck, I saw that it had completely overturned, lying on its side in the mud. The driver's side was the most damaged, crushed up against the ground, while the passenger side was barely visible. The rear of the truck was still intact, though. I couldn't see anyone inside. The truck's engine was still running, the headlights flickering weakly. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. I made my way around to the driver's side. I called out, but no one answered. My heart was beating a little faster now, but I pushed it aside. There had to be someone, right? Someone in need of help. I reached the driver's side and tried the door, but it was jammed shut. I couldn't open it, and the windows were too dark to see through. I tried the other side of the truck, thinking maybe I could get in that way. That's when I noticed something strange, a strange, pungent smell coming from the back of the truck, mixed with the wet earth and rain. It wasn't until I rounded the back of the truck that I saw it clearly, rows of cages stacked inside. I froze. There were people in those cages. At first, I thought they were just unconscious, or maybe in shock from the crash. But as I stepped closer, I realized with sickening clarity that they were alive. Their eyes were wide, some of them were shaking, and they were all locked in place. I couldn't tell if they were bound with ropes or chains, but their arms and legs were clearly restricted. I felt a wave of nausea, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. I stood there, staring at them, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just an accident, it was something worse. Much worse. I looked back at the truck's cab, wondering who the driver was, but there was no sign of anyone. No one had come to check on these people. I reached into my pocket for my phone again, trying to get a better signal to call 911, but it was useless. The signal was still terrible. I was standing there, trying to think, when I heard a sound. Footsteps. I quickly ducked behind the truck, my heart racing. I was so focused on the people in the back that I didn't hear them coming. It was two men, walking toward the truck, talking in low voices. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could hear their voices, and the tone wasn't friendly. They were laughing about something, but I didn't understand what. The rain was too loud. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't spot me. I didn't know if they were the ones who had been driving the truck, or if they were involved in whatever this was, but I knew I couldn't stay hidden for much longer. I was terrified. I had no idea what to do. One of the men reached the truck first. He was wearing a raincoat, but the dark silhouette of his figure made him look even more menacing. The other man was behind him, walking toward the cages in the back. I pressed my back flat against the cold metal of the truck, praying they wouldn't turn around and see me. The first man opened the back of the truck with a sharp, metallic sound. I heard the rattling of the cages. The other man's voice rose up, something about checking the cargo. They weren't talking about the crash. They were talking about the people in those cages like they were nothing more than goods to be moved. I had no idea what to do. I had to help them, but if I moved, I was risking everything. I had no way of knowing if these men were armed or if they'd hurt me. I looked around quickly. The road was still empty, and there were no other houses for miles. I couldn't count on anyone else coming. I could feel the panic starting to rise again. My hands were trembling, and I didn't know how much longer I could stay quiet. I wanted to run, but I couldn't leave without calling for help. The phone was useless, but I had to get away from these men first. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It was then that I heard the men talking again. One of them had opened a phone, and I heard a voice on the other end. They were discussing something about moving the cargo. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't an accident. This was a plan. A sick, twisted plan. I slowly backed away, my eyes never leaving them. When I got far enough to where I thought they wouldn't hear me, I turned and ran as quietly as I could. I didn't look back until I got back to my car, and even then, I was afraid they might be following me. I didn't stop until I was in a safer area with better cell service. I finally called the police, but by the time they arrived, the truck and the men were gone. There was no trace of them. They must have heard the sirens coming, or maybe they knew the cops were on their way. I don't know, but it was gone. The cages were gone. The people, whoever they were gone. I've thought about that night every day since. I can't shake the image of those poor people in the back of that truck, trapped and helpless. I don't know what happened to them, but I hope they somehow got out. I hope they did. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just a small group of us heading out to the woods for some camping. We were a tight-knit group, 4 friends who had been hanging out together since college. The plan was to hike, set up camp, and just enjoy the quiet of the forest. No phones, no distractions, just us in nature. We had been hiking for a few hours, making our way along an unfamiliar trail we found on a map. The weather had been nice, the kind of cold breeze that makes the woods smell fresh. There wasn't much talk as we walked, just the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional laugh about something stupid. We all agreed that this was the kind of trip we needed, peaceful and undisturbed. Then we came across the cabin. It wasn't marked on the trail map, which was odd. It wasn't even in good condition. The roof was sagging in some places, and there were a few windows that were boarded up, but there was no mistaking it, this place had been abandoned for a while. There was no road leading to it, no signs of people around, just trees and silence. At first, we all thought it was just an old hunting cabin or maybe some kind of relic from years ago. It wasn't uncommon to find these kinds of things when you ventured into the woods. But then, we noticed something strange. There was a new, fresh-looking trail of footprints leading up to the porch. It wasn't a large set, just a single pair of boots, maybe a man's, making their way in and out of the cabin. I don't know why, but none of us decided to turn around right then. Instead, we stood there for a few moments, looking at each other. It was like we all had the same idea, that we should check it out. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was because we were tired and the cabin looked like a perfect place to rest for a while. Whatever it was, we moved closer. As we approached, the creaky wooden steps groaned beneath our weight, and one of the boards nearly snapped. The air around the cabin felt colder, but it wasn't the kind of cold that comes from a shift in temperature. It was more of an uncomfortable chill that seemed to seep into your bones. We joked about it at first, saying it was just the old cabin giving off strange vibes, but there was something about it that felt wrong. We knocked on the door, half expecting no one to answer. But when no one responded, we opened it slowly, half expecting the hinges to squeak, but it didn't. It was a soft, almost deliberate creak. The inside was dark, dust settling on the furniture and wooden floors. The place looked abandoned for sure, but there was something that didn't sit right. There was an odd smell, a mix of stale air and something earthy, like wet dirt. The furniture was sparse, an old couch covered in a gray sheet, a coffee table with some old magazines, a chair near the window that looked out toward the trees. It was empty, except for one detail, a backpack sitting on the floor, near the door. It was open, as though someone had just been there and left in a hurry. We all stood there for a while, not really knowing what to say. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, but I didn't want to be the first to admit that something felt off. Then one of my friends, Chris, picked up the backpack. He opened it, rummaging through the contents. "Hey, check this out," he said. We all crowded around. Inside the bag, there were a few sets of clothes, a flashlight, a couple of water bottles, and what looked like a few empty cans of food. But there was something else, something that made my stomach drop. Tucked in between the cans was a thick rope, and next to that, a half-empty bottle of something that smelled like alcohol. Chris pulled his hand back quickly, and for the first time, we all looked at each other with a shared realization this wasn't just an abandoned cabin. Someone had been living here recently. It was all too recent. "I think we should leave," Sarah said quietly, her voice shaking. She was usually the most adventurous of us, always the one encouraging us to take risks. But now, even she looked unnerved. We didn't argue. We quickly made our way back to the door, but when we got to the porch, we heard something, a faint sound from the woods behind the cabin. A snap of a twig, followed by a slow, steady footstep. We froze. I didn't even have to look at the others to know they were thinking the same thing. Someone was out there. And they knew we were here. "Let's go." "Now," I said, my voice a little too sharp. We turned to leave, but then the door to the cabin slammed shut behind us, like it had been pushed by an invisible hand. Everyone jumped. We ran down the stairs, and as we rounded the corner of the cabin, we saw a figure standing in the woods, just out of reach of the trees. It was too dark to make out his face, but his figure was unmistakable, tall, with a dark jacket and what looked like a pair of boots. I don't know who moved first, whether it was me or one of the others, but we didn't waste a second. We ran in the opposite direction, towards the trees, not even looking back to see if he was following. We didn't need to. The sounds of the footsteps behind us were enough to make us push harder, faster. We didn't stop until we reached the trail again, and even then, we kept running. We didn't speak to each other at first, just breathing heavily, but eventually, when we stopped to catch our breath, we realized how close we had been to something terrible. We made it back to the car without further incident. As we drove away, none of us said much. I think we were all too shaken, too scared to speak about what had just happened. The cabin, the backpack, the figure in the woods, it didn't make sense. But we all knew one thing, someone had been living there, and they weren't far away. I don't know who they were, or what they intended to do, but I'll never forget the look in the man's eyes, the same kind of coldness that made my blood run cold. I'm just thankful we made it out alive. And I'll never go camping again without wondering if someone's watching me from the woods. I'm a bus driver, been doing it for a few years now. I've always kept to myself, focused on the job. The route I drive isn't anything special, it's mostly local commuters, a few regulars, some tourists. I've gotten used to the faces, the people who get on and off at their usual stops. It's a predictable job, and I liked it that way. That was, until I noticed him. It started out normal enough, just another day at the wheel, but there was this one guy. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, always wearing a jacket and jeans, even on the hottest days. I couldn't tell much about his face. He always kept his head down, usually staring at his phone or a book, but I'd see him from the rearview mirror. At first, I thought nothing of it, but then it became weird. Every time I looked in the mirror, I'd see him sitting in the same seat, right near the back, a few rows from the exit. He'd get on the bus at the same stop, at the same time, and he never got off. The other passengers would get off at their stops, a few people would board, but this man? He stayed. He stayed for the whole route. At first, I thought maybe he had nowhere to go or was just lost in thought. But after a few days of it, I started getting this feeling in the pit of my stomach. He never spoke to anyone. He never even moved from that seat unless the bus made a stop. And even then, it was just a slight shift in his posture, as if he was making sure no one took the seat beside him. One night, I was driving the last shift, and I noticed that he was still there, sitting in the back. The bus had emptied out, everyone else had gotten off, but not him. I was doing my usual check, making sure no one had left anything behind, when I glanced in the mirror. He was watching me. Not in a subtle way, but in a way that felt almost too obvious. I looked away, pretending I didn't notice, but I could feel his eyes on me. The thing is, I wasn't sure what made me more uncomfortable, the fact that he was still there, or the fact that I couldn't remember when I had started noticing him. The next day, I was on the same shift, driving the same route. There he was again. Same jacket, same spot. It was like clockwork. I didn't think much of it at first, but this time, I could see him watching me more closely, almost like he was waiting for something. His eyes weren't wandering like they usually did. They were fixed, staring straight at me through the rearview mirror. I tried not to let it get to me. I told myself it was nothing. But by the third day, I was starting to feel paranoid. He hadn't missed a single shift, and he hadn't gotten off once. One afternoon, I decided to take a different route. It wasn't a big change, just a small detour, but enough that it would make the ride a little longer. The guy didn't budge. He was still sitting in the same spot, his eyes still locked on me through the rearview mirror. It made my skin crawl. The last stop before I was supposed to turn around is always quiet, a residential area, usually just a couple people getting on or off. But that day, when I glanced up at the rearview, I saw him stand up. I didn't think much of it at first. I thought he was finally getting off, but then he just walked to the front of the bus. I stopped the bus, confused. I waited for him to get off, but he just stood there. Not looking out the window, not doing anything. He was just standing there, staring at me. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound casual. No answer. He just stood there, staring. The moment felt like it stretched on forever. I felt a cold sweat forming on my back, a nervous knot in my stomach. Why wasn't he leaving? Why wasn't he getting off the bus? Is there a problem? I asked again, my voice a little shaky. He didn't speak. He just took a step closer, moving toward the driver's seat. "Hey," I said, trying to stay calm, "you need to sit down." But he didn't listen. He was almost beside me now, and I could smell his cologne, something cheap, overpowering. I could feel him right behind me. Then, just as I was about to say something else, he spoke. "You're driving the wrong way," he said, his voice low, almost too quiet for me to hear over the hum of the bus engine. I didn't know what to say. What? I stammered. He leaned closer, and I could see the faintest smile on his face. "You're supposed to go the other way," he said again. The tone in his voice, the calmness, made my chest tighten. I didn't know what he meant, or if he was just messing with me, but I could feel something wasn't right. I pulled the bus over to the side of the road, pretending to check the route. He still didn't move, still standing next to me, watching. I could hear his breath now, soft and steady. And that's when I saw it, something glinting in his hand. A knife. My heart stopped. I froze, too scared to move, but just enough awareness in me to know that I had to act fast. "Is there something I can help you with?" I asked, trying to sound calm but failing miserably. He didn't answer, just kept his eyes locked on mine, his grip tightening around the knife. I knew I had only one option: get away. I made a snap decision. I grabbed the radio, hit the button, and called for help. It wasn't until I saw his face change, his eyes narrowing, that I realized what had just happened. He knew. He knew I'd called for help. I wasn't sure if he was going to attack or leave, but when I heard sirens in the distance, he made a sharp turn and bolted off the bus without a word. I didn't wait. I locked the doors, called the police, and stayed in that bus until they arrived. They found nothing when they searched the area. No trace of the guy. I'm still driving, but I haven't seen him since that night. Every time I look in the rearview mirror now, I feel like I'm waiting for him to be there. Just sitting in that same spot, staring at me. But every day, he's not. I had been job hunting for months when I got an email about an interview. It was for a position I'd applied to a few weeks earlier, some kind of administrative role. The email came from someone named Daniel Rowe, the hiring manager. The company, Bridgepoint Solutions, seemed legit. They had a basic website, nothing fancy, just enough to show they existed. The interview was set for 5 p.m. on a Friday. I remember thinking it was a weird time, but I didn't question it. The address was in the industrial area on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't far, maybe a 20-minute drive from my apartment. When I got there, it was already getting dark. The building was a large, gray structure, the kind of place you'd expect to see offices for logistics or manufacturing companies. The parking lot was almost empty except for a few cars scattered around. That felt strange, but I told myself it was because it was late on a Friday. I parked and walked to the front door. It looked clean and well kept, with a small plaque that read Bridgepoint Solutions. I pressed the buzzer, and a voice came through the speaker. "Come in." "Second floor," the man said. The door clicked, unlocking, and I stepped inside. The lobby was quiet. Too quiet. There was no receptionist, just an empty desk with a stack of outdated magazines. The air felt still, like no one had been there in a while. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe they were cutting costs or working remotely. I took the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was dimly lit, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. There were several doors, all closed. At the end of the hall was one door slightly ajar with a light on inside. A small sign next to it read Conference Room B. I knocked. "Come in," the same voice said. I stepped inside, and a man stood up from the table. He looked ordinary, dark hair, a button-up shirt, probably mid-40s. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Emily," he said, holding out his hand. "Yes," I said, shaking it. His grip was firm, too firm, and his hand was cold. Something about him put me on edge, but I couldn't pinpoint what. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like he was studying me. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair across the table. The room was sparse. Just a table, a few chairs, and a whiteboard with nothing written on it. No laptops, no paperwork, no sign of any actual business. I sat down, my stomach twisting. "So, tell me about yourself," he said, leaning forward. I started talking about my work experience, but he barely listened. His eyes were locked on mine the entire time, unblinking. He didn't take notes, didn't ask follow-up questions. When I paused, he just smiled again, that same empty smile. "Interesting," he said after a moment. "You seem very qualified." "Thank you," I said, forcing a smile. He didn't respond right away. Instead, He tilted his head slightly, like he was sizing me up. The silence stretched on too long. "Do you live nearby?" he asked suddenly. That question threw me. It had nothing to do with the job. About 20 minutes away," I said cautiously. He nodded, as if that was important information. "Do you live alone?" Now I was alarmed. That had nothing to do with the interview. I laughed nervously. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," he said, sitting back in his chair. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, watching my every move. I decided I'd had enough. "I don't think this is relevant to the position," I said, standing up. "Thank you for your time." "Sit down," he said, his voice low and firm. I froze. There was no friendliness in his tone anymore. He stood up, blocking the door. My heart started pounding. I tried to keep my voice steady. "I think we're done here," I said, stepping toward the door. "You're not going anywhere," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a knife, the blade catching the light. My blood ran cold. "Don't scream," he said. "If you do, I'll make this worse for you." I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The room was small, and he was between me and the door. "Please," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I won't tell anyone. Just let me go." He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, the knife glinting in his hand. I backed up until I hit the wall, my breathing quick and shallow. Then I remembered my phone. It was in my bag, slung over the back of the chair. He hadn't taken it. If I could just distract him for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep him talking. He smiled again, that same empty smile. "Because I can," he said simply. While he spoke, I inched toward the chair, my fingers brushing the strap of my bag. I grabbed it and yanked it toward me, pretending to stumble. The movement startled him, and he lunged at me. I screamed and swung the bag at him with all my strength. It hit his arm, knocking the knife to the floor. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the chair and slammed it into his chest, sending him stumbling back. I ran for the door, yanking it open and bolting down the hallway. He was right behind me, his footsteps pounding against the floor. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. I reached the stairs and practically threw myself down them, skipping steps, nearly falling. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. When I reached the lobby, I ran straight for the door, fumbling with the lock. He was halfway down the stairs when I finally got it open. I sprinted to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors just as he burst out of the building. He pounded on the driver's side window, yelling something I couldn't hear over my own panic breathing. I started the car and peeled out of the parking lot, not stopping until I was miles away. When I finally pulled over, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The police didn't find him. When they searched the building, it was empty, and the knife was gone. The company? It didn't exist. The website was a fake, probably set up just to lure people like me. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out of there, but I don't want to think about it. It happened last weekend. I still can't believe how close I came to something awful. I've gone over it in my head 100 times, and I don't think I'll ever stop replaying it. I went out with a couple of friends to a new bar downtown. It was one of those trendy places with low lighting, loud music, and barely enough room to move. We hadn't been out together in a while, so I wanted to enjoy myself, maybe a bit more than usual. The night started fine. We found a small table near the back, close to the bar, and took turns getting drinks. The place was packed, but the energy felt good, not too overwhelming. I wasn't drinking much because I wanted to stay sharp, but my friends were having a great time, laughing and dancing. At some point, I noticed a guy sitting at the bar, just across from our table. He wasn't with anyone, but he wasn't drinking much either. He kept looking over at us, mostly at me. He had this steady gaze that made me uncomfortable, but I told myself I was overreacting. It's a bar, people stare sometimes. A little while later, my friends decided to hit the dance floor. I wasn't feeling it, so I stayed behind to watch our stuff. That's when the guy got up and came over. He smiled and asked if he could sit down. I didn't want to be rude, so I nodded. He introduced himself as Adam and started asking questions, small talk about the music, the crowd, if I came here often. His voice was calm, but there was something off about him, like he was too practiced, too smooth. When my friends came back, he got up and walked away without a word. It was odd, but I was relieved he was gone. Later, one of my friends offered to grab the next round, but I said I'd go. I walked up to the bar and stood in the only open spot, next to Adam. I didn't even notice him at first. He acted surprised to see me, like it was a coincidence. He leaned in closer, saying something about how the bar was too crowded and asking what I was drinking. I didn't want to engage, so I just smiled politely and looked away. When the bartender handed me my drink, I saw Adam out of the corner of my eye. He was quick, too quick. He reached over, his hand brushing against my glass for barely a second. I froze. My brain told me what I saw, but it didn't feel real. He had slipped something into my drink. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, staring at it, my heart racing. Adam noticed. His expression changed, just for a moment. It was subtle, but I saw the shift in his face, like he knew I'd caught him. I didn't say anything. I grabbed the drink, acting normal, and walked back to the table. My hands were shaking. I set it down and told my friends I needed some air. Outside, the cool night air hit me, and I felt a bit steadier. I called one of my friends and told her what happened. She came out right away, and we decided to leave. As we were walking to the car, I glanced back toward the bar. Adam was standing at the entrance, watching us. I grabbed my friend's arm and told her to hurry. We got in the car and drove off. I thought that was the end of it. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I got home, I checked all the doors and windows twice. My apartment isn't in a bad area, but I still felt uneasy. I couldn't shake the image of Adam's face, the way he looked at me. It was around midnight when I heard the first sound, a faint tapping at the front door. I froze, my chest tightening. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate tap. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind. But then I heard it again, louder this time. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I called my friend, whispering into the phone. She told me to stay on the line while she called the police. The tapping turned into a knock. Not frantic, just steady, like whoever it was knew I was there. I grabbed a kitchen knife and backed away from the door, keeping the phone pressed to my ear. My friend was panicking, asking if I could see anyone. And then I heard a voice. "Hey," it said, muffled through the door. "It's me, Adam. I think you left something at the bar." My blood ran cold. How did he know where I lived? I didn't respond. I didn't move. "I just wanted to talk," he said, his voice calm, almost friendly. Come on, open the door. I stayed silent. The knocking stopped. For a few minutes, there was nothing but silence. I thought maybe he had left, but then I heard something outside the living room window. I turned off the lights and crouched down, peeking through the blinds. Adam was standing there, staring in, his face partially lit by the street lamp. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stared, like he was waiting for me to break. The police arrived 10 minutes later, though it felt like hours. I saw their car pull up, the red and blue lights flashing. Adam bolted. The officers searched the area but didn't find him. They said they patrolled the neighborhood for the rest of the night and told me to stay somewhere else if I didn't feel safe. I stayed with my friend that night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept wondering how he found me, what he would have done if I hadn't noticed him at the bar. The police said there wasn't much they could do unless he came back. I've since changed my locks, installed security cameras, and started carrying pepper spray. I still don't know if he'll come back, but I'm trying to be prepared if he does. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe again. I don't know how to explain what happened that night, but I know I'll never forget it. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear footsteps outside my tent, even though I know I'm safe now. I've been camping a lot in my life, mostly by myself. It's the only way I can really clear my head, get away from everything, and just think. I'd gone out to a remote site in the woods, not too far from town, but far enough that I was pretty much alone. The kind of place where you're not likely to run into anyone. It was my second night out there. I had set up camp by a small creek, surrounded by tall trees. The sun had set hours ago, and the fire had burned down to embers. I was inside my tent, reading a book and listening to the sounds of the night. It wasn't a full moon, but the sky was clear, and there was just enough light from the stars and the glow of the embers to see a little around the campsite. Around 1 a.m., I started hearing something. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but then I realized it was something more distinct, footsteps. I didn't want to overthink it, but they were too close, too deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps were light, but they were steady and moving around the perimeter of my tent, circling it. I lay there in the dark, tense, unsure of what to do. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps weren't the kind you'd expect from wildlife. They were heavier, more purposeful. I heard them pause for a moment, then resume walking. My mind raced. Could it be another camper? Was someone lost? But I hadn't seen anyone else around. There were no other camps nearby, and the thought of someone else being out here this late walking around my tent, so close, was enough to make my stomach twist. I couldn't help myself. I had to look. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, just a little, and peered out into the dark. The forest was eerily quiet now. No more footsteps. It was hard to see much beyond the reach of the dim light from my campfire. The shadows of the trees stretched across the ground, but there was nothing there. No person, no animal, nothing. I shut the tent flap quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been right outside, watching. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I spent the next few hours awake, listening for any other sounds. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me tense up. I didn't sleep at all. I kept expecting to hear the footsteps again, but nothing came. Finally, around 4 a.m., I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of birds chirping, sunlight peeking through the fabric of my tent. I lay there for a moment, trying to calm myself down. The night felt like a strange dream, but I knew it wasn't. The footsteps, the silence, the feeling that someone had been so close it was real. I didn't even want to check outside, but I knew I had to. I needed to see if anything was out of place, or if I was just being paranoid. I unzipped the tent slowly, carefully, and stepped outside. The air was cool, and the ground was damp with morning dew. The fire was just a pile of cold ashes now, and everything was still. At first glance, it seemed like nothing had changed. But then I noticed something. My gear, my backpack, and some of the other things I had left around the tent had been moved. Not by a lot, but enough that it wasn't where I'd left it. My backpack, which had been leaning against a tree, was now lying a few feet away, half open. My water bottle had been knocked over, and the small flashlight I always kept by my side was in a different spot than I remembered. It wasn't a huge mess, but it was clear that someone had been through my things. My stomach turned. I checked the rest of the camp. The area around the tent was untouched, but I still had that sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. I walked over to the creek and looked down at the water. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. That someone had been watching me all night. The worst part was the silence. There were no other campers nearby. No one else in the woods. The footsteps I heard, they couldn't have been from an animal. No animal would have been so close to my tent and walked around it in such a deliberate way. I couldn't explain it. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, trying to get out of there. I wasn't going to stay another night. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. Something wasn't right. Whoever had been out there, they knew I was alone. And I had no idea if they were still out there, waiting. As I loaded up my gear into my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone walking toward me from the trees. But there was nothing. Just the woods, quiet as ever. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The footsteps. The way everything had been moved. I don't know if I'll ever understand who or what it was. But I know I'm never camping alone in those woods again. The thought that someone could be out there, watching, that close, it's something I can't shake. It started as a normal hike, at least that's what I kept telling myself. I've always loved the outdoors, and this trail was a popular one. I'd heard good things about it, and a few friends had hiked it before. So, when I was able to get a group together, I thought it would be the perfect weekend getaway. There were 4 of us, me, Sarah, Max, and Charlie. We were all seasoned hikers, so we weren't worried about the difficulty of the trail. We planned out our route and were ready to take it slow, stop at the scenic spots, and enjoy the time together. The first day was uneventful. We started early, the weather was perfect, and everything felt right. We stopped every few miles to rest, check out the views, and snack. There were other hikers around, but nothing unusual. Everyone was just doing their thing, and we were doing ours. It was our 3rd rest stop that we met them. I can't even remember their names now, but I'll never forget their faces. A couple, maybe in their late 30s, early 40s, came up to us while we were sitting by the side of the trail. They seemed friendly enough at first. Introduced themselves, asked if we were enjoying the hike, the usual small talk. What struck me as odd right away was how much they knew. "We saw you back at the first rest stop," the man said. His voice was smooth, friendly, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't place at the time. "Yeah, We took a quick break there too, Sarah replied, smiling politely. Nice spot, isn't it? The woman chimed in. We noticed you guys are heading toward the summit, right? It caught me off guard. I mean, of course, we were heading toward the summit. It was the whole point of the hike, but I didn't remember telling them that. We hadn't spoken to anyone else about our plans, at least not in detail. Yeah, I said, we're planning to make it to the top by the end of the day, take in the view. Oh, that's great, the woman said with a smile. You'll love the view, especially as the sun sets. It's the perfect time to be up there. I gave a polite nod, but the conversation felt strange. Too personal, too familiar, considering we had only just met them. Still, we weren't being rude, so we made small talk for a few more minutes before they left. They waved goodbye, and we watched them continue up the trail. After they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The way they knew our plans, the way they seemed to be watching us. I didn't want to say anything, not to make the others paranoid, but I felt a sense of unease creeping in. We continued on, but then it happened again. At our next stop, a couple of hours later, they appeared again. Just like before, they came up to us while we were resting. This time, they were asking about our pace, what we planned to do after reaching the summit, how long we thought it would take us. Again, they seemed way too familiar with our plans, asking questions that seemed innocent enough but were unsettling in the way they knew so much. By now, I was feeling uncomfortable. I couldn't explain why, but I knew it wasn't normal for strangers to show up at every stop. I kept looking around, half expecting them to pop out of the trees. Max noticed it too. Are we being followed? He asked quietly, leaning in toward me. I don't know, I said. But it's weird, right? I mean, how do they know what we're doing? I don't know, he said, but we've only been on this trail for a day. What are the odds they're on the exact same schedule as us? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew something was off, but we couldn't prove it. And that's what bothered me the most. There was no solid reason to be scared. It was just a feeling, one that kept growing with each encounter. Later that evening, when we made camp, we were all a little on edge. We set up our tents, started a fire, and tried to get some rest. But every time we heard someone approaching, I tensed up. I kept expecting them to appear again, but they didn't. Or at least, not right away. Around dusk, just as the light was fading, the couple appeared once more. This time, they didn't even greet us, they just walked into our camp like they belonged there. Beautiful evening, isn't it? The man said, smiling that same unnerving smile. Yeah, it is, Sarah replied, but I could tell she was getting uncomfortable too. Her voice had that tight, forced quality to it. We thought we'd check out your campsite, the woman said casually, glancing around. It's nice. You're all set up for a good night. I wanted to tell them to leave, but I didn't know how. They hadn't done anything wrong exactly. They hadn't crossed any lines that I could point to. But they were too familiar, too intrusive. I could feel my stomach twisting in knots, and I could see that the others were starting to feel the same way. Max cleared his throat. Well, it's getting late, he said, standing up. We should probably turn in for the night. Big day tomorrow. The couple didn't seem to take the hint. They hung around for another few minutes, making small talk about the weather, about the wildlife in the area, but it wasn't just talk. They were watching us, studying us in a way that made me feel exposed, like they could see every little detail about us, like they were taking notes. Finally, they left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't done with us. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound in the woods had me on edge, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside my tent. I know that sounds paranoid, but after everything that had happened, I couldn't help it. By morning, we were all feeling it. Tired, jumpy, like we couldn't trust anything around us. But we couldn't leave. We were committed to the hike, and there was no way out now. The next day, the couple was there again. This time, they were waiting for us at our next rest stop. They weren't hiding or sneaking around, they were just there, as if they had been waiting for us the whole time. "We've been ahead of you," the man said, like it was no big deal. "It's a nice little stretch of trail up there, but you might want to take it slow. The climb's a bit steeper than it looks." I looked at the others, and I could see the fear in their eyes. We all knew something was wrong now. It wasn't just the coincidences. It wasn't just the way they kept showing up. It was the way they acted, the way they knew things they shouldn't. I don't know what their plan was. I don't know what they wanted from us. But I do know this: by the time we reached the final stretch of the trail, I was done. I told the others we were leaving, that we were cutting the hike short, and I didn't care if we didn't finish. I didn't care if we missed the summit. We turned around and headed back down the trail. This time, we didn't stop at the rest stops. We didn't take any chances. The couple never showed up again, and by the time we got back to our car, I was so relieved I almost didn't care about how weird the whole thing had been. I don't know if they were just strange hikers, or if they had some other reason for following us. But I do know this: I'll never hike that trail again.